Here's the thing about human history. We get it backwards. We think civilization is old. We think our story began when we built the pyramids, or when we invented writing, or when we first planted seeds in the ground. But those things, they just happened. The pyramids were built 4,500 years ago. Writing appeared about 5,000 years ago. Agriculture started maybe 12,000 years ago. That feels ancient. It feels like the beginning. It's not even close. Modern humans appeared 300,000 years ago. People who looked exactly like us. Same size brains, same bodies, same potential. For 190,000 years they left almost nothing behind. No cities, no farms, no writing, no monuments, no art we can find, nothing that would make you think, yes, these are humans like me. Just stone tools, the same stone tools, for thousands of generations. Think about that timeline. Really let it sink in. If human history were a 24-hour clock, civilization appears at 11:56 p.m. Everything you learned in history. Class happens in the last 4 minutes. The other 23 hours and 56 minutes, we have no idea what people were doing. We know they survived. We know they spread across Africa and eventually the world. We know they had the same brains we have. But what were they thinking? What were they doing with all that time? This isn't a small gap in the record. This is almost our entire existence as a species. We've been behaviourally modern for maybe 50,000 years. That's when art appears, when culture explodes, when humans start acting like humans. But we've been anatomically modern for 6 times longer than that. The hardware was there. The software wasn't. Or maybe it was, and we just can't see it. Maybe they were fully human in ways that don't fossilize, in ways that don't leave traces. Maybe they told stories that would make us weep. Maybe they loved as deeply as we do. Maybe they wondered about the stars and what happens when we die. We don't know. We can't know. What we do know is this. For the vast majority of human existence, nothing seemed to happen. Or at least, nothing we can see. And then suddenly everything changed. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's continue. Around 50,000 years ago, something shifted. Art appeared. Tools got more complex. Culture exploded. Humans started leaving their mark. Nobody knows why. That's the mystery we're going to explore tonight. Not what happened after we became human, but what happened before, in that long, quiet stretch when we had the capacity for everything but did almost nothing, or seemed to do nothing. Because maybe the real question isn't what were they doing. Maybe it's what were they waiting for. The bones tell us when. They don't tell us how. We know modern humans appeared 300,000 years ago because we found the skulls. We found them in Morocco, in a cave called Jebel Irhoud. 5 individuals. Their faces look like ours. Their brain cases are the same shape and size. The bones are 300,000 years old. That's not a guess. That's thermoluminescence dating of the stone tools buried with them. That's electron spin resonance dating of the teeth. Multiple methods. Same answer. These people looked like us. But looking human and being human aren't the same thing. The brains were the right size, about 1,400 cubic centimeters. That's the modern average. The frontal lobes were developed, the areas for language, for planning, for abstract thought, all there. So they had the hardware. But what were they doing with it? For the first 190,000 years, almost nothing we'd recognize as culture. No art, no jewelry, no symbolic objects, no elaborate burials, just stone tools, and not even interesting stone tools. The same design, over and over, for thousands of generations. They're called Acheulean hand axes, teardrop-shaped rocks, flaked on both sides, sharp edges all around. They cut, they scrape, they dig, they work, and they didn't change. For 1.6 million years, humans and their ancestors made the same tool. The design appeared with Homo erectus. It continued through archaic humans. It was still being made when modern humans showed up. Think about that. Your iPhone is obsolete in 3 years. These hand axes stayed the same for 1.6 million. Not because people were stupid, because they worked. Why fix what isn't broken? But here's what's strange. These people had modern brains. They could have innovated. They could have experimented. They could have made art or music or elaborate shelters. They didn't. Or if they did, it was in ways that don't survive. Wood rots, leather decays, songs disappear into air. Maybe they were fully human. Maybe they told stories around fires. Maybe they painted their bodies. Maybe they danced. We don't know. What we do know is this. They left almost no trace. For 190,000 years, modern humans were essentially invisible in the archaeological record. Then something changed. Around 100,000 years ago, the first hints of symbolic behaviour appear. In South Africa, in a cave called Blombos, archaeologists found pieces of ochre, red iron oxide, with geometric patterns carved into them, crosshatches, deliberate, repeated, made by someone who wanted to create a pattern. That's symbolic thought. That's someone saying, I'm going to make marks that mean something. The ochre pieces are 100,000 years old. In the same cave they found shell beads, Nassarius shells, pierced, strung together, worn as jewellery or decoration. Someone collected these shells. Someone pierced them carefully. Someone wore them. That's adornment. That's saying, I want to look a certain way. I want others to see me as special or beautiful or powerful. That's culture. But here's the thing. These early signs of symbolic behaviour appear. Then they disappear. Then they appear again somewhere else. Then they disappear. Again, it's not a steady progression. It's flickering, like a candle trying to stay lit in the wind. For 50,000 years, culture keeps almost starting, almost catching fire, then going out. Why? One theory is population. When groups got large enough, culture could develop and spread. When populations crashed, culture was lost. Small groups can't maintain complex traditions. If only 50 people know how to make something, and half of them die in a drought, the knowledge dies too. Maybe early humans were living on the edge, barely surviving, every generation fighting to pass on the basics, no room for art or experimentation. Another theory is climate. For most of the past 300,000 years, Earth was in an ice age, not frozen everywhere, but colder, drier, harsher. Africa was mostly desert. The habitable zones were small and scattered. Groups were isolated from each other. Maybe culture needs connection. Maybe ideas need to spread and mix and build on each other. Maybe isolated groups couldn't develop complexity. When the climate improved, populations grew. Groups met, ideas spread. When the climate crashed, populations shrank. Groups isolated. Knowledge was lost, back and forth, for thousands of generations, but neither theory fully explains it. Because the brains were there, the capacity was there. These weren't archaic humans slowly evolving toward modernity. These were modern humans, genetically us. So what was missing? Some researchers think it was language, not the ability to speak, but the ability to speak precisely, to use grammar and syntax to convey complex ideas. Maybe early humans could communicate, But maybe they couldn't teach. Maybe they couldn't explain abstract concepts. Maybe each generation had to rediscover everything. Without precise language, culture can't accumulate. You can show someone how to make a hand axe, but you can't explain why you chose that particular stone. You can't pass on the theory. Other researchers think it was social structure. Maybe early groups were too small or too unstable. Maybe they didn't have elders who could preserve knowledge. Maybe they didn't have specialists who could focus on innovation. Culture needs stability. It needs people who aren't just surviving, who have time to think and experiment and create. Maybe that stability took time to develop. Still others think nothing was missing. Maybe early humans were fully cultural. Maybe they made art and music and told stories. Maybe they just didn't make things that survive. Stone lasts, ochre lasts, shell beads last, but wood doesn't, leather doesn't, body paint doesn't, songs don't. Maybe we're looking at a shadow of what was really there. Maybe the archaeological record is missing 99% of early human culture. That's possible, but it doesn't explain everything. Because around 50,000 years ago, something definitely changed, and it changed everywhere. Art explodes. Tools become diverse and specialized. Jewelry appears. Elaborate burials appear. Cave paintings appear. Humans start acting unmistakably human. This is called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or the Great Leap Forward, or the Creative Explosion. Different names for the same mystery. What happened 50,000 years ago that didn't happen in the previous 250,000 years? The most dramatic evidence comes from Europe, because that's where we have the most caves, and caves preserve things. In France and Spain, deep underground, early humans painted. They painted animals, horses, bison, mammoths, lions, rendered in ochre and charcoal, detailed, beautiful, sophisticated. The oldest cave paintings in Europe are about 40,000 years old, but the tradition probably started earlier in Africa or Asia. We just haven't found those sites yet. These paintings aren't crude, they're not stick figures. They show movement and perspective and anatomical detail. Whoever made them understood animals, understood how bodies move, understood how to capture life. On a wall? They also understood something else. They understood that images can convey meaning, that you can make something that represents something else. That's symbolic thought at its fullest, and it's not just paintings, it's sculptures, figurines carved from ivory and stone. Some are animals, some are humans, some are strange combinations. The Lion Man of Hohensteinstadel is 40,000 years old. It's a human body with a lion's head, carved from mammoth ivory. Took hundreds of hours to make. Why would someone spend hundreds of hours carving a creature that doesn't exist? Because they were thinking symbolically. They were combining concepts. They were imagining. That's what makes us human. Not big brains. Imagination. But why did it take so long to appear? That's the question that haunts anthropology. We had the brains for 250,000 years. We had the hands, we had the capacity, but we didn't use it. Or we used it in ways we can't see. And then suddenly we did. Some researchers think it was a genetic mutation. Some small change in how the brain was wired. Maybe a change in the FOXP2 gene, which affects language. Maybe something else. One mutation, spreading through the population, unlocking symbolic thought. But genetic studies don't support this. Modern humans and early humans have the same genes. No magic mutation appears 50,000 years ago. Others think it was cultural. Maybe someone invented something. A new way of teaching, a new social structure, a new idea that spread like wildfire. Maybe someone figured out how to pass on knowledge more effectively. And once that happened, culture could accumulate, could build on itself. That's more plausible. Because culture can change fast, much faster than genetics. But we don't know what that invention was. Language, religion, art itself. We don't know. What we do know is this. 50,000 years ago, humans crossed a threshold. They went from being anatomically modern to being behaviourally modern. They became us. And once it started, it didn't stop. Culture kept building, kept accelerating. Within 10,000 years, humans had spread to Australia. Within 20,000 years, they'd reached Europe and Asia. Within 40,000 years, they'd crossed into the Americas. Everywhere they went, they brought culture, art, tools, language, stories. They brought humanity. But that long period before, those 250,000 years of near silence, that's still a mystery. Were they human? Yes, genetically, anatomically. Were they us? Maybe not. Not in the way we think of humanity. Or maybe they were. Maybe they were just as human as we are. Just as capable of love and wonder and creativity. Maybe they just lived differently. In ways that don't fossilize. Maybe the real question isn't what were they missing. Maybe it's what have we lost. Because they survived. For 250,000 years, through ice ages and droughts and disasters we can barely imagine. They survived without cities or agriculture or technology. They survived because they were human, in the most basic sense. They knew how to live on this planet. We're still learning. There's something perfect about falling asleep to human history. These aren't just facts and dates. They're questions we've been asking since we first looked up at the stars. Who are we? Where did we come from? What makes us human? The answers keep changing, but the questions stay the same, and maybe that's enough. Maybe wondering is more important than knowing. Let the mystery carry you. Let the darkness hold you. We'll keep exploring together. For 190,000 years, nothing much happened. Think about that number. 190,000 years. That's not a typo. Modern humans appeared around 300,000 years ago in Africa. Their skeletons look exactly like ours. Same height, same brain size, same bodies. If you dressed one in jeans and a t-shirt, they'd blend right in at a grocery store. But for almost 200,000 years, they left almost nothing behind. No cave, paintings, no jewellery, no burial rituals, no art, no tools more complex than sharp rocks. Nothing that screams human culture the way we think of it. Just people, living, surviving, dying, generation after generation after generation, the same tools for thousands of years, the same patterns, the same silence. This is called the long stability. And it's one of the strangest mysteries in all of human history. We know these people had the hardware. Their brains were our brains. The physical capacity was there. But something was missing, or something hadn't clicked yet. Nobody knows what. Archaeologists dig up sites from 250,000 years ago. They find hand axes, simple stone tools, flaked rocks with sharp edges. They dig up sites from 200,000 years ago. Same tools. 150,000 years ago. Same tools. 100,000 years ago. Same tools. It's like someone hit pause on human development. The bodies evolved, the brains grew, but culture stayed frozen. Here's what we know for certain. Around 300,000 years ago, a new species appeared in Africa. Homo sapiens. Us. The archaeological evidence is clear. Skulls from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. Homo remains from Ethiopia. These people had high foreheads, rounded skulls, chins, all the features that make us modern. Their brain size averaged 1,350 cubic centimeters. That's within the normal range for humans today. Some were bigger, some were smaller, but the capacity was there. So what were they doing with those brains? Not much, apparently. The toolkit from 250,000 years ago is called Middle Stone Age technology. It's better than what came before, but not by much. These were hand axes and scrapers, simple flakes of stone, sharp enough to cut meat, tough enough to scrape hides, good for digging roots. They worked. That's the key thing. They worked well enough. And when something works well enough, there's no pressure to change it. Think about your own life. How many things do you do the exact same way your parents did? Your grandparents? Not because it's the best way, but because it works, because it's familiar. Because why fix what isn't broken? Now multiply that by 10,000 generations. That's the long stability. These weren't stupid people. That's important to understand. Their brains were just as powerful as ours. They could learn, they could plan, they could communicate. We know this because when things finally did change, they changed fast. The capacity was always there. But capacity isn't the same as culture. You can have a brain capable of writing poetry. That doesn't mean you'll write poetry. You need language first. You need the concept of metaphor. You need a reason to put words together in new ways. You can have a brain capable of making art. That doesn't mean you'll make art. You need the idea that images can represent things. You need pigments. You need someone to show you how. Culture has to be invented, and then it has to be taught, and then it has to spread. For 190,000 years, most of that didn't happen. Or it happened in tiny pockets and then died out. There are hints, brief flickers. A site in South Africa called Blombos Cave shows something interesting. Around 100,000 years ago, people there made small engravings on pieces of ochre. Red pigment, geometric patterns, crosshatches, lines. It's not art exactly, but it's something. It's intentional. It's symbolic. Someone made marks that meant something, and then it stopped. The next layer up in the cave. Nothing. No more engravings. No more patterns. Just regular tools again. The same thing happens at other sites. A shell bead here. A piece of worked bone there. Signs that someone was thinking symbolically. Someone was decorating. Someone was making things that served no practical purpose. And then silence again. It's like watching someone almost invent fire. They get close. They understand the principle. And then they walk away. Why? Maybe the group died out. Disease, famine, bad luck. When you're living in small bands of 30 or 40 people, one bad winter can wipe out everything, including ideas. Maybe the knowledge wasn't passed down. If the person who knew how to make beads died before teaching anyone, the skill died too. No writing, no way to preserve information. Everything lived in people's heads. Maybe there was no pressure to innovate. Life was stable, food was available, the group survived. Why change? This is the paradox of the long stability. We think of innovation as inevitable. Better tools, better methods, progress. But progress isn't automatic. It requires specific conditions. You need population density. Ideas spread faster when more people interact. A lone group in the wilderness might invent something brilliant. But if they never meet another group, that invention dies with them. You need surplus. When everyone spends all day finding food, there's no time for experimentation. No time to try new techniques. No time to fail and try again. You need communication, not just language, but networks, trade routes, ways for information to travel from one group to another. For most of the long stability, humans didn't have these things. Population was low, maybe 10,000 people in all of Africa. scattered across a massive continent, groups living hundreds of miles apart, going years without seeing outsiders. Life was subsistence level: hunt, gather, eat, sleep, repeat. There was no surplus, no abundance, no safety net, and communication was limited. Groups had language. We're pretty sure of that. But they were isolated. Ideas that sparked in one place couldn't spread. So culture sputtered. It flickered on. It died out. It started again somewhere else. But it never caught fire. Not yet. The really strange thing is how consistent this pattern was. It's not like some groups raced ahead while others lagged behind. Everyone was stuck, from South Africa to Ethiopia to Morocco. The same tools, the same lack of decoration, the same silence. It suggests something fundamental was missing. Not intelligence, not capacity, but some key ingredient that makes culture stick. Some researchers think it was language. Maybe early humans had simple communication, but not full language. Not the kind of complex grammar and syntax we use today. Without that, you can't teach complicated ideas. You can't pass down detailed knowledge. Each generation has to figure things out from scratch. Others think it was social structure. Maybe groups were too small, too isolated, too unstable. Culture needs a critical mass. It needs enough people interacting in complex ways. Without that, innovations die. Still others think it was environmental. Maybe life was too hard, too unpredictable, climate swinging between extremes, resources scarce. When you're fighting to survive, you don't have energy for art. The truth is probably all of these things, and more we haven't thought of yet. What we know is this. For 190,000 years, modern humans existed. They had the brains, they had the bodies, they had the potential. But potential isn't destiny. They lived in small groups. They moved with the seasons, they followed game, they gathered plants, they made fire, they made tools, they survived. And that was enough. Generation after generation after generation, living lives we can barely imagine. No writing to record their thoughts, no art to show their dreams, no monuments to mark their existence, just footprints in the sand, washed away by the next rain. It makes you think about progress differently. We assume humans naturally move forward, naturally improve, naturally innovate. But maybe that's not true. Maybe innovation is the exception, not the rule. Maybe stability is the default state. Maybe those 190,000 years weren't a failure. Maybe they were just different. A different way of being human. One that worked for a very long time. These people survived ice ages, droughts, volcanic eruptions. They spread across Africa. They adapted to different environments, forests, savannas, coasts, mountains. They must have been incredibly skilled, incredibly knowledgeable. They knew every plant, every animal, every water source, every shelter. That knowledge was sophisticated, complex, hard-won. But it was practical knowledge, survival knowledge. It wasn't written down, it wasn't decorated, it didn't leave traces we can easily see. So we call it the long stability. We call it stagnation. We wonder what took so long. But maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe the question isn't, why did it take so long? Maybe it's what finally changed. Because something did change. Around 70,000 years ago, something shifted. Culture exploded. Art appeared. Jewelry, burial rituals, complex tools, trade networks, everything that makes us recognizably human, all at once, or at least all very quickly by archaeological standards. The long stability ended, and the question that haunts researchers is simple. Why then? What happened? What finally unlocked the potential that had been sitting dormant for 190,000 years? We'll explore those theories. But for now, just sit with the mystery. 190,000 years of silence. People who looked like us, thought like us, but lived in ways we can barely comprehend. They're our ancestors, direct line. Their DNA flows through us. Their survival made us possible, but they left almost nothing behind. No voices, no stories, no names, just stone tools and questions, and the strange, humbling knowledge that being human doesn't automatically mean creating culture. Sometimes it just means surviving, day after day, year after year, century after century. For 190,000 years, that was enough. Around 70,000 years ago, something changed. Small groups of humans left Africa. They walked out into a world they'd never seen, crossed deserts, followed coastlines, moved into territories their species had never touched. This wasn't the first time humans tried to leave, but it was the first time it stuck. Earlier groups had ventured out. Around 120,000 years ago, humans reached the Levant. That's modern-day Israel and Lebanon. Archaeological sites show they lived there for thousands of years, made tools, built fires, survived, and then they disappeared. Climate shifted, resources dried up, or maybe they just died out. Small populations are fragile. One bad decade can erase everything. But around 70,000 years ago, another wave left. And this time, they kept going. They reached southern Arabia, then India, Southeast Asia, Australia. They moved faster than any human migration before. Within 20,000 years, they'd spread across half the planet. The evidence is everywhere. Genetic markers in modern populations, archaeological sites along ancient coastlines, tools that show up in new places at specific times. This wasn't a planned expedition. Nobody woke up and decided to walk to Australia. These were small moves. A group following game, another seeking better fishing, gradual expansion that added up over centuries. But the scale is stunning. From East Africa to Australia is 8,000 miles, through deserts, across mountains, over open ocean. These people didn't have maps, didn't have boats, at least not at first, didn't know what lay ahead. They just walked, and kept walking. The route is debated. Most evidence points to a coastal migration, groups following the shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula, down to the Persian Gulf, along the coast of India, through Southeast Asia. The ocean was their highway, rich in resources, fish, shellfish, seabirds, predictable food sources that could support small bands as they moved. Sea levels were lower then. Ice locked up massive amounts of water. Coastlines extended miles beyond where they are today. Land bridges connected islands. Shallow straits could be crossed on foot during low tide. The world looked different, more connected, easier to navigate, but still dangerous, still unknown. Think about what it takes to migrate. You need to carry everything: tools, weapons, fire-making materials, water containers, everything your group needs to survive. You need knowledge: which plants are safe, which animals are dangerous, where to find water, how to read the weather. You need social bonds. Migration is stressful. Groups fracture under pressure. You need trust, cooperation, shared purpose, and you need luck. One wrong turn into a dead-end valley, one season without rain, one encounter with a predator. Any of these can end everything. Thousands of groups probably failed, died out, left no trace. We only know about the ones who made it. The genetic evidence tells a story. Every human outside Africa today descends from this single migration wave. One successful expansion, one founding population. Scientists can track it through mitochondrial DNA. That's genetic material passed down through mothers. It mutates at a predictable rate, like a molecular clock. By comparing mutations in different populations, researchers can trace lineages back, build family trees, figure out who came from where and when. The pattern is clear. All non-African populations share common ancestors who lived around 70,000 years ago. The genetic diversity outside Africa is lower than inside Africa. That's the signature of a bottleneck, a small founding group that expanded rapidly. How small? Estimates vary. Maybe 1,000 people, maybe 10,000. Somewhere in that range. That's it. That's the population that seeded the entire world outside Africa. Your ancestors were in that group. So were mine. So were everyone's who isn't from sub-Saharan Africa. We're all descendants of that single wave of migration, that one successful attempt to leave home and find something new. The journey to Australia is particularly remarkable. Getting there required crossing open ocean. Even with lower sea levels, there were gaps, stretches of water too wide to see across. Somebody built boats or rafts, something that could carry people and supplies across miles of open water. The earliest evidence of humans in Australia dates to around 65,000 years ago, maybe earlier. Sites in northern Australia show stone tools, hearths, signs of occupation. That means within 5,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had crossed the ocean and reached a new continent. That's astonishingly fast. It suggests these weren't random wanderings. People are actively exploring, testing boundaries, pushing into new territories. The boats themselves haven't survived. Wood and plant fibers decay, but the evidence of their existence is undeniable. You can't get to Australia without boats, and once there, humans spread rapidly. Within a few thousand years they'd reached the southern coast, crossed deserts, adapted to rainforests, settled every habitable region. They encountered animals that had never seen humans, giant marsupials, enormous lizards, flightless birds, an ecosystem that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. Many of those animals went extinct shortly after humans arrived. The exact cause is debated. Hunting, habitat change, climate shifts, probably all of these. But the pattern repeats everywhere humans go. Megafauna disappear. Large, slow-breeding animals that had no fear of humans, easy targets for experienced hunters. It's a reminder that humans have always changed their environments. We're not separate from nature, we're part of it. And we've been reshaping it for 70,000 years. The migration into Europe happened later, around 45,000 years ago. Groups moving north from the Middle East, following river valleys, hunting mammoth and reindeer. Europe was cold. Ice sheets covered the north. Tundra stretched across what's now France and Germany. Harsh conditions, but rich in game. And Europe was already occupied. Neanderthals had lived there for 200,000 years. They were adapted to the cold, knew the landscape, had their own tools and culture. What happened when modern humans met Neanderthals is one of the most fascinating questions in human history. We'll explore that more later. But for now, know this. The meeting happened, and it changed both groups forever. The Americas were the last continents to be settled. The exact timing is still debated. But most evidence points to around 15,000 years ago, maybe earlier. Groups crossing from Siberia into Alaska, following the coastline, or moving through an ice-free corridor, spreading south through North America, then Central and South America. Within 2,000 years, humans had reached the southern tip of South America. From Alaska to Patagonia, that's 10,000 miles in 2,000 years. The speed is remarkable. It suggests these weren't slow, gradual expansions. These were rapid movements. groups actively exploring, seeking new territories. Why? What drove this expansion? Population pressure is one answer. Groups growing too large for available resources, splitting into smaller bands, some staying, some moving on. Climate change is another. Shifting rainfall patterns, changing vegetation, game moving to new areas, humans following. Curiosity might be the simplest explanation. Humans wonder what's over the next hill, the next river, the next horizon. That curiosity is hardwired. It's what makes us human. But there's also something deeper, something about this particular time period, something that made successful migration possible when earlier attempts had failed. The culture had changed. Remember the long stability. For 190,000 years, humans had the brains but not the culture. Something shifted around 70,000 years ago. Art appeared. Complex tools. Symbolic thinking. That cultural revolution made migration possible. Better tools meant better hunting, better food processing, better shelter construction. Language had evolved. Complex grammar, abstract concepts, the ability to plan, to coordinate, to share knowledge across generations, social. Structures had become more sophisticated. Larger groups, trade networks, ways to maintain relationships across distances. All of this made migration less risky. Groups could adapt faster, learn quicker, survive in new environments. The timing isn't coincidental. The cultural explosion and the successful migration out of Africa happened together. They enabled each other. Culture made migration possible. Migration spread culture, a feedback loop that accelerated both. And once it started, it didn't stop. Humans kept moving, kept exploring, kept adapting. Every environment presented new challenges. Deserts required different survival strategies than rainforests. Arctic tundra demanded different tools than tropical coasts. Humans figured it out. Every time, in every place. That adaptability is our superpower. We're not the strongest species, not the fastest, not the best climbers or swimmers, but we adapt, we learn, we share knowledge, we build on what came before. That's what made the Great Migration possible, and that's what continues to define us today. The people who left Africa 70,000 years ago didn't know they were making history. They were just living, following food, seeking safety, raising children. But their choices echoed forward. Their willingness to move into the unknown, to try new things, to adapt and survive. We carry that legacy. Every person alive today outside Africa descends from those migrants. Their DNA flows through us, their resilience, their curiosity, their courage. They walked out of Africa with stone tools and fire. No maps, no plans, no idea what they'd find. And they changed the world forever. The migration wasn't smooth, wasn't easy. Groups died out, failed, turned back. But enough succeeded, enough pushed forward, enough survived to reach new lands and establish new populations. And from those small founding groups, billions of descendants would eventually emerge. That's the power of migration, the power of movement, the power of saying yes to the unknown. It's a pattern that repeats throughout human history. People moving, exploring, settling new places, each wave building on the last, from Africa to Arabia, from Arabia to India, from India to Australia, from the Middle East to Europe, from Siberia to the Americas, each step expanding the human range, each generation pushing boundaries their parents never imagined. We're still doing it, still moving, still exploring, still adapting to new environments. The Great Migration out of Africa never really ended. It just changed form, from walking to sailing, from sailing to flying, from Earth to space. the same impulse, the same curiosity, the same willingness to step into the unknown. It's what makes us human, not our brains, not our tools, but our willingness to move, to change, to become something new. Those first migrants leaving Africa 70,000 years ago, they were us, and we are them, still moving, still exploring, still reaching for the next horizon. But humans weren't alone out there. When those groups walked out of Africa 70,000 years ago, they entered a world already occupied. Other human species had left earlier, much earlier, and they'd survived. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied Eastern Asia, maybe other groups we haven't discovered yet. The fossil record is incomplete. We only find what's preserved. These weren't primitive ancestors. They were sophisticated humans, different species but fully human in the ways that matter. Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, maybe larger. They made complex tools, controlled fire, buried their dead, cared for injured group members, created art. For 200,000 years they'd thrived in Ice Age Europe, hunting mammoth, surviving brutal winters, building shelters, making clothing. They were perfectly adapted to their environment. Stockier bodies, shorter limbs, better heat retention, stronger muscles, built for the cold, and they were smart. Really smart. Archaeological sites show careful planning, coordinated hunts, stone tools that required hundreds of precise strikes to create, knowledge passed down through generations. They weren't the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. That image comes from early reconstructions, scientists looking at Neanderthal bones and seeing primitive features. But modern analysis tells a different story. These were people, just different people. Denisovans are even more mysterious. We found very few fossils, a finger bone, some teeth, a jaw. That's about it. But their DNA tells us they existed, and they ranged across a huge territory. From Siberia to Southeast Asia, maybe further, they interbred with modern humans. We know because their genes show up in living people today. Populations in Oceania carry significant Denisovan ancestry, up to 5% in some groups. That means contact happened, meetings, relationships, children born from unions between species. The same thing happened with Neanderthals. Every person of European or Asian descent carries Neanderthal DNA, about 2% on average. Some people have more, some less. But it's there. This discovery shocked scientists. For decades, the prevailing theory was replacement. Modern humans left Africa and replaced other human species, outcompeted them, drove them to extinction. No interbreeding, no mixing, just replacement. That theory collapsed when genetic sequencing became possible. In 2010, scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome, compared it to modern humans, found matches. The evidence was undeniable. Our ancestors didn't just meet Neanderthals, they had children with them. Think about what that means. These were different species, separated for 500,000 years of independent evolution, as different from each other as wolves and coyotes. But they could still produce fertile offspring, children who survived, had children of their own, passed genes forward. That's remarkable. Most species can't do that. When different species mate, the offspring are usually sterile. Mules, for example, born from horses and donkeys, but unable to reproduce. Humans and Neanderthals could. Humans and Denisovans could. The barriers weren't absolute. So what happened when they met? What were those encounters like? We don't know the details. Can't know. No written records. No eyewitness accounts. Just genetic evidence and archaeological sites. But we can imagine small bands crossing paths, maybe at a water source, or a good hunting ground, or a cave shelter during winter. Initial wariness. These strangers look different, sound different, but they are clearly human. They have fire, tools, language, maybe conflict at first, competition for resources, territorial disputes, violence, but also curiosity, trade, shared knowledge, and eventually relationships. The genetic evidence suggests this wasn't rare, wasn't just one or two isolated incidents. Interbreeding happened multiple times, in multiple locations, over thousands of years. Some Neanderthal genes provided advantages, immune system adaptations, better suited for European diseases. Those genes spread, got passed down, still exist today. Other genes caused problems, increased risk of certain diseases, depression, diabetes. Type 2 diabetes shows links to Neanderthal variants. Evolution is messy. Mixing populations brings both benefits and costs. The Denisovan genes are particularly interesting. Some variants helped humans adapt to high altitudes. Tibetans carry a Denisovan gene that helps them process oxygen in thin air, essential for surviving above 13,000 feet. That gene didn't come from modern human populations. It came from Denisovans, inherited through interbreeding, preserved because it was useful, natural selection at work. Genes that help survive get passed on. Genes that hurt get filtered out. Over generations, the helpful ones spread. But here's what's really fascinating. The interbreeding was limited. Only 2% Neanderthal DNA. Only 5% Denisovan in the highest populations. That suggests barriers existed. Not genetic barriers, cultural ones. These groups lived near each other for thousands of years, overlapped in territory, shared resources, but they didn't fully merge. They remained distinct populations, separate identities, different cultures. Why? What kept them apart? Language might be one factor. Neanderthals could speak. We know from their anatomy, the hyoid bone, the structure of their vocal tract. They had the hardware for speech, but their language was probably different from modern human language. Different sounds, different grammar, different concepts. Communication would be difficult, not impossible, but hard enough to maintain social distance. Cultural differences matter too. Different traditions, different beliefs, different ways of making tools and organizing society. Those differences create identity, create in-groups and out-groups, us and them. Even today, humans separate along cultural lines. Language, religion, customs. These boundaries are powerful. They shape who we marry, where we live, who we trust. 70,000 years ago, those boundaries existed too. Maybe stronger, maybe more rigid. Interbreeding happened, but it was probably the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, groups stayed separate, lived parallel lives, occasionally interacted, rarely merged, and then, gradually, Neanderthals disappeared. Around 40,000 years ago, the last populations died out. Denisovans vanished too, probably around the same time. Why? What happened? This is one of the biggest questions in human evolution, and there's no simple answer. Competition is part of it. Modern humans and Neanderthals hunted the same game, used the same caves, needed the same resources. When resources are limited, one group usually wins, not through direct conflict necessarily, just through slight advantages that compound over time. Modern humans had better tools, more sophisticated weapons, longer-range projectiles. That means more successful hunts, more food, healthier children, faster population growth, better social networks helped too. Modern humans formed larger groups, maintained relationships across greater distances, could call on help when needed. Trade networks spread innovations faster. A new tool design in one region could reach another in years instead of generations. All of this gave modern humans an edge. Not a huge edge, but enough. Climate change played a role. Around 40,000 years ago, temperatures fluctuated. Ice advanced and retreated. Ecosystems shifted. Neanderthals had survived climate changes before. For 200,000 years they had adapted to Ice Age cycles. But this time was different. This time they were competing with modern humans. Populations already stressed by climate faced additional pressure from a rival species. Small populations are vulnerable. Neanderthal groups were probably never large. Maybe 10,000 to 50,000 individuals total across their entire range. Modern humans numbered in the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. Genetic diversity was higher, population resilience was stronger. When both groups faced the same challenges, modern humans recovered faster, bounced back from setbacks, expanded into territories Neanderthals abandoned. Over thousands of years, Neanderthal numbers dwindled, groups became isolated, genetic diversity dropped, inbreeding increased. The final populations were probably small, scattered, struggling. And then they were gone. The last Neanderthal died sometime around 40,000 years ago, maybe in Gibraltar, maybe elsewhere. We don't know exactly where or when, but they left traces in our genes, in our immune systems, in our ability to survive cold climates and high altitudes. They're not completely extinct. Part of them lives on, in us. That's a strange thought. You carry Neanderthal DNA, actual genetic sequences from a different human species, active in your body right now. Some of those genes affect your appearance. Hair color, skin tone, nose shape, the shape of your skull. Others affect your health, disease resistance, pain tolerance, how your body responds to certain foods. You're not purely modern human. You're a hybrid, a mixture of species that met 50,000 years ago and created something new. We all are. Everyone outside Africa carries this mixed heritage. It changes how we think about human evolution. We're not a single lineage, not a clean line from ancient ancestors to modern humans. We're a braided stream, multiple populations mixing, separating, mixing again, creating new combinations. That pattern is old, older than modern humans, older than Neanderthals. All through human evolution, populations have met and mixed. Genes have flowed between groups. Species boundaries have been fuzzy. We like clean categories, neat boxes. This species, that species. Clear distinctions. But biology doesn't work that way. Life is messy. Boundaries are porous. Categories blur. The story of human evolution is a story of mixing, of populations trying new combinations, of genes flowing across boundaries we thought were solid. Neanderthals and Denisovans are just the most recent examples, the ones we can still detect in our DNA. But there were probably others. Earlier meetings, earlier mixing, lost to time because the genetic traces faded. Every time human populations met, genes mixed. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. Each encounter changed both groups. That's how evolution works. Not through isolation, through contact, through mixing, through trying new combinations and seeing what survives. The humans who left Africa 70,000 years ago weren't replacing other species. They were joining them, meeting them, learning from them, mixing with them. And from that mixing we emerged, modern humans, carrying genes from multiple sources, built from multiple lineages. We're the result of thousands of encounters, thousands of meetings between groups who were different but not too different. Who could communicate across boundaries? Who could create something new together? That's our heritage, not purity, not a single origin, but mixture, combination. The willingness to meet the other and find common ground. It's still happening. Humans are still mixing, still creating new combinations, still blurring boundaries we thought were fixed. The story that started 70,000 years ago continues. Different scale, different context, same fundamental pattern. We meet, we mix, we become something new. That's what makes us human, not our separation from others, but our connection to them. Now, we need to ask a harder question. What was happening inside their heads? We've talked about tools and migrations and meetings between species, but those are just the physical traces, the bones and stones left behind. The real story is invisible. It's about minds, about consciousness, about the inner experience of being human. And that's almost impossible to study. You can dig up a hand axe, measure it, analyze the stone, figure out how it was made, but you can't dig up a thought, can't carbon date an emotion, can't put a belief under a microscope. So how do we know what our ancestors were thinking, how they experienced the world? We make inferences, educated guesses based on indirect evidence. It's detective work with most of the clues missing. Start with brain size. That's measurable. Modern human skulls hold about 1,350 cubic centimeters of brain. Neanderthals had slightly more. Early Homo sapiens from 200,000 years ago had the same capacity we do. The hardware was there, the physical brain, same size, same basic structure. But hardware isn't everything. Your phone's processor matters less than the software it's running, the apps, the operating system, the code that makes it actually do things. Brains work the same way, size matters, but what matters more is how the brain is organized, what it's doing, how different parts connect and communicate. And that's where things get mysterious. For 190,000 years, humans with modern brains left almost nothing behind. No art, no jewelry, no burial goods, no signs of symbolic thinking. They made tools, basic ones, the same Acheulean hand axes their ancestors made 1 million years earlier. Functional, practical, but not creative. Then something changed, around 70,000 years ago. Maybe earlier in some places, maybe later in others. Suddenly the archaeological record explodes. Art appears, jewelry, decorated tools, burial sites with grave goods, evidence of ritual, evidence of belief. The hardware hadn't changed. These humans had the same brains their ancestors did. But the software was different. Something had switched on. Scientists call this the Great Leap Forward, or behavioral modernity, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Different names for the same mystery. Why did it take so long? What was missing for these first 190,000 years? Nobody knows for sure. But there are theories. Maybe language was the key, not just communication. Animals communicate. Dogs bark, birds sing, bees dance to show where flowers are. But human language is different. It's symbolic, abstract. We can talk about things that aren't here, things that happened yesterday, things that might happen tomorrow, things that never existed at all. That ability changes everything. Once you can talk about things that aren't present, you can plan, coordinate, share knowledge across time and space. You can tell stories, pass down information, build culture. Some scientists think language evolved gradually, started simple, got more complex over thousands of years. The final pieces fell into place around 70,000 years ago. Others think language appeared suddenly, a genetic mutation, a change in brain wiring. One generation couldn't really talk. The next generation could. We don't know which is right. Probably never will. Language doesn't fossilize, leaves no physical trace, but we can see its effects. Once language existed, everything changed. Theory of mind might be another piece. That's the ability to understand that other people have thoughts and beliefs different from yours. It sounds simple, obvious, but it's actually sophisticated. Most animals don't have it. They can't imagine what another creature is thinking. Human children develop theory of mind around age 4. Before that, they assume everyone knows what they know, sees what they see. After that, they understand deception, lying, hiding. They know other people have different perspectives. That ability is essential for complex society, for cooperation, for culture. You need to understand that others have knowledge you don't, that they can teach you, that you can learn from them. Maybe early humans lacked full theory of mind, had partial versions, enough to cooperate in small groups, not enough for larger social networks. And then something shifted. The ability strengthened, became more sophisticated, unlocked new possibilities. Working memory could be important too. That's your brain's scratch pad, the place where you hold information temporarily while working on a problem. Modern humans can hold about 7 items in working memory. 7 numbers, 7 words, 7 concepts. That's enough to do complex thinking, plan multiple steps ahead, consider different options. Imagine hypothetical scenarios. Maybe early humans had less working memory, could only hold 3 or 4 items. Enough for basic tool-making, not enough for innovation. Brain scans can't tell us. Working memory doesn't show up in skull shape, doesn't leave marks on bones, but it would explain the gap. The long period of stasis followed by sudden creativity. Another theory focuses on population size. Larger populations mean more innovation, more people trying new things, more chances for useful ideas to spread. Small groups are conservative. They stick with what works, can't afford to experiment. If a new technique fails, people might starve, but large populations have surplus, can take risks. If one group's experiment fails, others survive, and if it succeeds, everyone benefits. For most of human history, populations were tiny. A few thousand individuals spread across Africa. Isolated groups, limited contact. Then populations grew, groups connected, trade networks formed, ideas could spread faster, innovation accelerated. This theory has evidence behind it. Population genetics shows expansion around 70,000 years ago, groups getting larger, more connected, and the archaeological record matches. Art appears in multiple places around the same time, different styles, different materials, but the same impulse, the same creative explosion. That suggests a threshold, a critical mass. Once populations reached a certain size, culture took off. But here's what's really puzzling. Neanderthals had large brains. 2. Sophisticated tools. Long cultural traditions. They survived for 200,000 years, but they never made the leap, never created art, never developed symbolic thinking. At least not to the degree modern humans did. A few Neanderthal sites show hints of creativity. Pigments, perforated shells that might be jewellery, scratched patterns on rocks. But it's sparse, rare, nothing like the explosion of art modern humans produced. Why not? What was different? Maybe nothing fundamental. Maybe they were just as capable, just never developed the cultural traditions, never hit the population threshold. Or maybe something was different. some subtle aspect of brain organization, some small difference in how neurons connected, not visible in skull size, not measurable in fossils, but enough to matter. We'll probably never know. Can't run experiments, can't compare living Neanderthals to living humans. All we have are the traces they left, and those traces suggest similar capabilities but different outcomes. The question of consciousness is even harder. Were ancient humans conscious the way we are? Did they have the same inner experience? They must have felt pain, fear, hunger. Those are basic, universal among animals with nervous systems. But what about self-awareness? The sense of being a distinct individual? The voice in your head that narrates your experience? When did that appear? Was it always there, or did it emerge gradually? Some philosophers think consciousness is binary. Either you have it or you don't. Ancient humans were conscious. End of story. Others think consciousness has levels, degrees. That human consciousness became richer over time, more layered, more complex. The evidence is ambiguous. Burial practices suggest self-awareness. You don't bury someone carefully unless you understand death, unless you grasp that the person is gone but the body remains. Neanderthals buried their dead. So did early modern humans. That suggests they understood mortality, thought about it, maybe feared it. Art suggests even more. Creating images requires imagination, the ability to see something in your mind and make it physical. That's sophisticated consciousness, but we're guessing, inferring. The actual experience remains locked in the past. Here's what we know for certain. By 40,000 years ago, humans were fully modern. Not just physically, mentally, culturally. They created art, told stories, had beliefs, worried about the future, mourned the past, wondered about their place in the world. They were us. Same hopes, same fears, same fundamental questions. How do we know? Because the art tells us. The burial sites tell us. The care they took with the dead tells us. These weren't alien minds, they were human minds, asking human questions, seeking human answers. The journey from simple brains to modern consciousness took millions of years, countless small steps, most invisible to archaeology. But the end result is clear. By the time humans left Africa, they carried modern minds with them, minds that could imagine, create, believe. Those minds changed the world, not through physical strength, not through speed or size, through thinking, planning, cooperating, through the ability to see what wasn't there and make it real, to imagine a better tool and create it, to envision a safer shelter and build it, to dream of distant places and travel to them. That's the real revolution. Not the first stone tool, not the first fire. The first time a human looked at the world and imagined it different, better, changed, and then made that imagination real. We don't know exactly when that happened. The archaeological record is too sparse, the evidence too fragmentary. But it happened. Somewhere. Somehow. A mind sparked to full consciousness, saw itself seeing, thought about thinking, and from that moment everything was possible. Not just survival, but meaning, purpose. The search for understanding, that search continues. We're still asking the same questions our ancestors asked. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? The tools have changed. The knowledge has grown. But the questions remain, because they're human questions, built into the structure of consciousness itself. We are the descendants of those first conscious minds, carrying their curiosity, their wonder, their need to understand. That's our inheritance, not just genes and bones, but consciousness itself, The ability to ask why, to seek answers, to never be satisfied with what is, to always imagine what could be. From the darkness of those ancient minds comes something that shouldn't exist yet, something impossible. Art. Not just art, the first art. The moment humans stopped making things that worked and started making things that meant something. It appears around 40,000 years ago, maybe earlier. The dates keep getting pushed back as we find more. But whenever it started, it's stunning, sophisticated, fully formed, like someone flipped a switch and suddenly humans could create beauty. The most famous examples are in caves, deep caves, places you had to crawl to reach, dark chambers far from daylight, Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet Cave, places where Ice Age humans painted animals on stone walls by firelight. The paintings are incredible, not primitive stick figures, real art, detailed, dynamic, beautiful, horses running, bison charging, lions prowling, mammoths in profile, all rendered with skill that wouldn't look out of place in a modern gallery. The artist understood perspective, shading, movement. They used the contours of the cave walls to give animals three-dimensional form. A bulge in the rock becomes a bison's shoulder. A depression becomes a horse's belly. They mix pigments, ground red ochre, charcoal black, yellow clay. Created different colours, different textures. Some paintings show handprints. The artist placed their hand against the wall, blue pigment, around it, left a negative image, a signature that says, "I was here." Those handprints are haunting, 30,000 years old, but you could place your hand over them, match your fingers to theirs, connect across time. The caves weren't homes. Nobody lived in these deep chambers. Too dark, too dangerous, too far from water and food. They were special places, sacred maybe, ritual sites, places you went for a reason. Some caves show evidence of repeated visits over thousands of years, new paintings added, old ones respected, never painted over, a tradition maintained across generations. Why paint in caves? Why go so deep? Why work by flickering firelight when you could paint outside in daylight? Nobody knows for sure, but the location matters. These weren't casual doodles. This was important, meaningful, worth the effort and danger. Some archaeologists think the caves were like cathedrals, places of worship. The paintings were prayers, or offerings, or ways to connect with the spirit world. The animals depicted were important ones, hunted species, dangerous species, animals that mattered to survival. Maybe painting them was a form of magic, sympathetic magic. Paint the bison, control the bison, ensure a successful hunt. Or maybe it was about respect, honouring the animals, acknowledging their power, asking permission before the hunt. Others think the caves were schools, teaching places, where knowledge was passed down. The paintings were textbooks, visual guides to animal behaviour, which animals were safe to hunt, which were dangerous, how they moved, where they lived. The deep location could be about initiation, coming-of-age rituals, young people brought into the darkness, shown the sacred images, taught the old stories, or maybe we're overthinking it. Maybe they painted in caves because caves preserved the paintings, protected them from weather, kept them safe. Paintings outside would have faded, washed away, disappeared. The caves were archives, storage, ways to make the art last, but that doesn't explain the specific locations. Some paintings are in chambers you can barely reach, tiny spaces, crawl spaces, places where you'd have to squeeze through gaps in the rock. Why paint there? Why make it so hard to see? The effort suggests purpose, meaning. These weren't just decorations. They were important enough to justify the difficulty. The skill level is what really surprises people. These are the earliest paintings we've found, but they're not primitive, not practice runs, not first attempts. The artists knew what they were doing, had training, technique, experience, which means there must have been earlier art, simpler art, learning stages, but we haven't found it, or it didn't survive. Some scientists think humans were creating art long before 40,000 years ago, maybe on wood, or hide, or their own bodies, materials that don't preserve. The cave paintings might represent the peak of a long tradition, not the beginning, the moment when art became permanent, when humans started painting on stone. There's some evidence for this. Ochre crayons found at sites 100,000 years old, shells with holes drilled through them, beads, personal ornaments, not paintings, but signs of symbolic thinking, the desire to decorate, to make things beautiful. A site in South Africa called Blombos Cave has ochre pieces with geometric patterns scratched into them, 75,000 years old, cross-hatching, deliberate designs, not representational art, not pictures of animals, but patterns, symbols, something meaningful to the person who made them. That's art too. Abstract art, the earliest we've found. And it suggests the human impulse to create goes back much further than the cave paintings. The paintings are just what survived, what we can see. The animals in the caves are specific, not every species, mostly large herbivores, horses, bison, aurochs, mammoths. Predators appear too, lions, bears, hyenas, but less often. They're just not dominant. What's strange is what's missing. Reindeer were probably the most commonly hunted animal. They're everywhere in Ice Age sites. Bones, tools made from antlers, evidence of reindeer-based economies, but they're rare in cave art. A few examples, not many. The artist chose not to paint them, or painted them somewhere else, somewhere that didn't preserve. Fish are almost absent, birds too. Despite being important food sources, humans rarely appear. When they do, they're strange, distorted. Part human, part animal, figures with animal heads, or human bodies with hooves. Shamans maybe, spirit beings, transformations. The boundary between human and animal blurred. One famous image from Lascaux shows a man with a bird head, lying down or falling, next to a wounded bison, a spear nearby, a bird on a stick. What does this mean? A hunting accident? A ritual? A myth? A dream? We don't know. Can't know. The story is lost. Only the image remains. The techniques vary. Some paintings are simple outlines, drawn with charcoal or ochre, single lines defining the shape. Others are filled in, solid colours, shaded, multiple layers of pigment creating depth. Some use the spray technique. Pigment blown through a hollow bone creates a soft, diffused effect, good for backgrounds, for suggesting distance. Others are painted with fingers, or brushes made from animal hair, or pads of moss or fur. Each technique creates different textures. The artists understood their materials, knew how different pigments behaved, how to make them stick to stone, how to layer them for effect. They also understood composition, how to arrange multiple animals in a scene, how to create movement, flow, visual rhythm. At Chauvet Cave there's a panel showing lions, dozens of them, overlapping, moving together, like a pride on the hunt. The artist used the curve of the wall, made the lions seem to flow around it, three-dimensional, almost alive in the firelight. That's not accident. That's skill, training, artistic vision. Some caves show evidence of scaffolding, holes in the walls where poles were inserted, platforms built. The artists needed height to reach the ceiling, to paint high up. They planned ahead, brought materials, set up workspaces. This wasn't spontaneous, it was organized, deliberate. The pigments had to be prepared, ochre ground into powder, mixed with fat or water to make paint, stored in containers, shells maybe, hollow bones, leather pouches. Charcoal had to be collected, the right kind, from specific woods, burned at the right temperature, soft enough to draw with, hard enough not to crumble. All of this takes knowledge, experience, cultural transmission, someone teaching someone else, techniques passed down, which means there were specialists, people who were particularly good at painting, who practiced, who were recognized for their skill. Maybe they had a special role. Cave painters, artists, people who created the sacred images. Or maybe everyone could paint. It was a common skill, like making tools, something all adults knew how to do. We can't tell from the evidence. Both possibilities fit. What we can tell is that the tradition lasted. Caves show paintings from different time periods, separated by thousands of years, but in the same style, using the same techniques, cultural continuity, knowledge preserved, traditions maintained across generations. That's remarkable. Most Ice Age cultures changed constantly. Tools evolved, hunting strategies shifted, people adapted to changing climates and environments, but the cave art stayed consistent. The same animals, the same styles, the same sacred places used again and again. It suggests these places mattered deeply, were central to identity, to belief, to understanding the world. The caves weren't just art galleries, they were repositories of meaning, places where the past connected to the present, where humans connected to animals, where the visible world touched the invisible. Walking into these caves today is eerie, even with electric lights, even knowing you're safe. The darkness presses in, the walls close around you, the paintings emerge from the stone, animals watching, waiting. Imagine seeing them by firelight, shadows moving, the animals seeming to breathe, to shift, to come alive. That's the experience the Ice Age artists created, not static images, living presences, spirits captured in stone. Some archaeologists think the caves were portals, doorways to the underworld, the spirit realm, the place where animals came from before birth, where they returned after death. The deep chambers were the deepest parts of that realm, the most sacred, the most powerful. Painting there was dangerous, spiritually dangerous. You had to be prepared, protected, initiated. But if you succeeded, you could influence the spirit world, ensure good hunting, protect your people, maintain the balance between humans and animals. It's a theory, can't be proven, but it fits the evidence, explains the locations, the effort, the reverence. Other art forms appear around the same time. Sculptures, carvings, objects small enough to carry. The most famous are Venus figurines, small statues of women, usually carved from ivory or stone, sometimes modelled from clay. They emphasize certain features: large breasts, swollen bellies, wide hips, fertility symbols maybe, or representations of pregnancy. The faces are often blank, no features, just a smooth surface, or sometimes a suggestion of a hairstyle, braids, caps, elaborate designs. Hundreds has been found, across Europe, from Spain to Russia. All similar, all emphasizing the same features. They're portable, meant to be carried, held, passed around. Maybe they were charms, amulets, objects of power, or maybe they were dolls, teaching tools, ways to explain pregnancy and birth to children, or portraits, representations of real women, ancestors, important individuals, We don't know. The figurines don't come with explanations. We can only guess based on context and comparison. What's clear is they mattered. People made them carefully, kept them, sometimes buried them, treated them as valuable. Other carvings show animals, mammoths, horses, bison. Same species as in the cave paintings. Same attention to detail. Some are realistic. Accurate proportions. Careful observation of anatomy and movement. Others are stylized, abstract, simplified to essential forms, a few curved lines suggesting a horse, a spiral representing a mammoth's trunk. Both approaches show artistic thinking. Choices about representation, what to include, what to leave out, how to convey meaning. Jewellery appears too, beads, pendants, necklaces made from shells, stones, animal teeth, carved ivory. Some beads are tiny, less than a centimetre across, with holes drilled through them, strung on sinew or plant fibre, making these took hours, patience, precision. The holes had to be drilled carefully. One mistake and the bead shatters. Why bother? Why spend so much time on something decorative? Because it meant something, signalled something, identity maybe, status, group membership, or maybe just beauty. The desire to look nice, to wear something that catches the light, that moves when you move. That's human too, not just survival, not just function. The desire for beauty, for self-expression. Musical instruments appear, flutes carved from bird bones, hollow tubes with holes drilled along the side. 5 or 6 holes, enough to play different notes. Some have been reconstructed, played by modern musicians. They work, produce clear tones, a pentatonic scale, ancient music. What did they play? Melodies, rhythms, accompaniment for singing? We'll never know. Music doesn't preserve. Only the instruments remain. But their existence proves Ice Age humans made music, created sound for its own sake, not communication, not warning. Calls, but music. Art in another form. All of this appears relatively suddenly, around 40,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier. The dates are fuzzy, but the pattern is clear. Before this, almost nothing. A few ochre crayons, some beads, hints of symbolic thinking. After this, an explosion. Art everywhere, in caves, on portable objects, jewellery, sculpture, music. It's called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or the Creative Explosion, the moment humans became fully modern, culturally modern. The brains were there earlier, the capacity existed, but something unlocked it, released it, let it flourish. Population growth maybe. More people meant more ideas, more experimentation, more chances for innovation to spread. Or language. Once humans could talk about abstract concepts, they could talk about art, teach techniques, share visions, build traditions, or social complexity. Larger groups needed ways to signal identity, to mark territory, to establish status. Art served those functions. Probably all of these, multiple factors combining, reinforcing each other, creating conditions where art could thrive. What's remarkable is how sophisticated it is. Right from the start, these aren't crude first attempts, they're masterpieces. The Chauvet cave paintings are among the oldest, 30,000 years old, maybe 35,000, and they're among the best, detailed, dynamic, skillful. Later paintings aren't better, just different. The peak of artistic achievement came early, not gradually. That suggests the tradition was already mature, already developed. The earliest surviving examples aren't the first, they're just the first that lasted. Somewhere, earlier, humans were learning to draw, to paint, to carve, practicing, experimenting, developing techniques. Those early attempts didn't survive, or we haven't found them yet, but they must have existed. You don't create the Chauvet paintings without practice, without training, without a cultural tradition of art making. The cave artists had teachers, learned from masters, spent years developing their skills, which means Ice Age societies valued art, made space for artists, supported them, gave them time to practice, resources to work with. That's a choice, a cultural choice, to prioritize beauty, meaning, expression, not just survival, not just getting enough food and staying warm, but creating, making the world more beautiful, more meaningful. That's what makes us human, not big brains, not tools, not language. All of those matter. But they're means to an end. The end is meaning, purpose, the search for beauty and truth, the desire to create something that lasts, that matters. The cave painters knew this. They went into the darkness, carried fire into the deep places, painted animals on stone walls. Not for practical reasons, for spiritual ones, for artistic ones. Because it mattered, because they needed to. That need is still in us. The same impulse, the same drive. We still create art, still search for beauty, still try to make meaning from the chaos. We're their descendants, carrying their vision, their creativity, their refusal to accept the world as it is, their insistence on making it mean something. The paintings remain, 30,000 years later, still beautiful, still powerful, still speaking across time. They say, we were here, we saw beauty, we created it, we mattered, and they did. They do, because they showed us what we could be, what we are, creatures who don't just survive, who create, who dream, who make meaning. That's the real revolution. Not the first tool, not the first fire, the first painting, the first sculpture, the first song, the moment humans decided survival wasn't enough, that life should be beautiful, meaningful, worth celebrating. That decision changed everything, made us who we are, made us human. Picture the world 25,000 years ago. It's cold, not just chilly, but bone-deep cold. Ice sheets cover much of the northern half of the planet. In North America and Northern Europe, nothing grows except some moss and grass. Huge glaciers, a mile thick in places, crawl across the land. There's no Canada as we know it, no Britain, just a frozen plain, locked in ice. Even the sea levels are lower because so much water is trapped in the ice. The world map looks strange. You could walk from France to England, from Siberia to Alaska. Everywhere you go, the wind bites, the air is dry, nights are long and dark. Sometimes, in parts of Europe, it's so cold that trees can't survive. Only scrubby plants and tough animals remain. This is the last great ice age, sometimes called the last glacial maximum. It peaked about 20,000 years ago, but really, it lasted tens of thousands of years. Now think about what it meant to live back then. Imagine trying to survive in a world where winter never really ends. You'd need thick clothes, made from animal hides. You'd need fire every night, shelter that could stand up to snow, and wind. Food is a daily challenge. You can't farm. There's a wheat or corn. Everything you eat is what you can hunt, fish, or gather. Mammoths still roam in herds. Woolly rhinos shamble across the steppe. There are giant deer with huge antlers, cave bears, cave lions, and packs of dire wolves. Reindeer are everywhere, but the cold keeps you moving. If you stay in one place too long, you'll run out of food or freeze. So people travel in groups, following the herds, sheltering in caves or building simple huts from bones and hides. It's easy to think of the Ice Age as endless hardship. But here's the thing. Humans didn't just survive it. They adapted. They found ways to turn the cold to their advantage. They didn't just huddle in caves hoping for better weather. They created new tools, new strategies, and new ways to live. Let's look at the evidence. Archaeologists have found remains of Ice Age camps all across Europe and Asia. Sometimes it's just a scatter of stone tools and animal bones. Other times it's more elaborate, rings of mammoth bones, fire pits, piles of flint flakes. In Eastern Europe, some shelters were built from the bones of mammoths. People stacked the giant bones into circles, then covered them with hides. It was like building a house out of the leftovers from a feast. These bone huts were sturdy, insulated, and could last for years. In Ukraine, at a site called Mezherish, archaeologists found 4 huts made from over 150 mammoth bones. That's a lot of mammoths. The huts are arranged in a circle, with hearths in the middle for warmth. Around the huts there are piles of flint carefully chosen for making tools. Someone even buried a mammoth skull upside down, maybe for a ritual, maybe just for storage. Nobody knows for sure. People used every part of the animals they hunted. Bones became tools and building material. Hides turned into clothes, shoes, tents. Sinew, the tough fibers from muscles, was used as thread. Nothing was wasted. This wasn't just about survival. It was about making the best of what you had, and the tools they made show real skill. During the Ice Age, humans invented new kinds of blades and points, sharp, thin, and strong. They shaped flint into long, razor-like flakes. Some points were used as spear tips, others were made to fit into handles or shafts. This is called the blade technology. It's a step up from the old chunky hand axes. The new tools were lighter, faster, more effective for hunting and butchering big animals. Some groups even made needles from bone. Not thick, clumsy needles, but fine ones with tiny eyes for thread. Imagine trying to drill a hole through a sliver of bone without breaking it. That takes patience. And it shows that Ice Age people were sewing, probably making fitted clothes, maybe even boots and mittens. That's a game changer. Proper clothes mean you can survive much colder temperatures. Then there's the hunting technology. Spears were common, but at some point humans invented the atlatl, a spear thrower. It's a simple tool, just a stick with a notch, but it lets you throw a spear farther and harder. Suddenly, hunters could strike from a distance with more power. Some places even show signs of early bows and arrows, not everywhere, but enough to say it was part of the Ice Age toolkit. Let's talk about food. Hunting big animals sounds impressive, but it wasn't easy. Mammoths and bison are dangerous. A single hunt could end in disaster. So people used every trick they knew. Some groups drove herds off cliffs, a risky business but effective if you could pull it off. Others set traps or dug pits. Reindeer were probably a staple because they travelled in large herds and returned to the same places each year. You could predict where they'd be. But hunting wasn't the only way to eat. People gathered plants, roots, berries, and nuts when they could find them. They fished, especially in rivers that didn't freeze all winter. Some sites show evidence of fish traps, simple fences built out of sticks or stones. When fish swam by, they got caught, making for an easy meal. Even in the coldest places, people found ways to store food. Sometimes they dried meat or froze it in the ground. In a way, the Ice Age was nature's refrigerator. If you had a surplus, you could keep it for lean times. Fire was essential, not just for warmth, but for cooking, light, and protection from predators. Archaeologists have found hearths with layers of ash, evidence of repeated fires over years. People learned how to find the right wood, how to keep a fire going in wet weather, how to bank coals overnight so they could relight the fire in the morning. Mastering fire was the heart of Ice Age life. Social life wasn't simple either. Groups were small, maybe 20 to 40 people. Too many mouths and you couldn't feed everyone. Too few and you risked dying out or getting picked off by predators. So bands met up, with other bands to trade, find mates, share stories and exchange ideas. Sometimes they came together for big hunts or gatherings, then split apart again. This kept bloodlines fresh and let good ideas spread, and evidence shows there was trade. Not just swapping meat for hides, but real long-distance exchange. Archaeologists have found seashells from the Mediterranean in Germany, amber from the Baltic in France, and flint from hundreds of miles away. These weren't just lucky finds. Someone carried them, maybe as gifts, maybe as symbols of connection. It's a sign that Ice Age people had networks, even across wild, frozen landscapes. Let's look at a famous site, Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic. Around 27,000 years ago, people lived here at the edge of the ice. Archaeologists found the remains of huts, hearths, and thousands of stone tools. But what's really interesting is the art and ritual evidence. Dozens of small clay figurines, some of animals, some of women, baked in a fire. These are among the oldest ceramics in the world. Not pots for cooking, but sculptures. People also buried their dead here, sometimes with jewellery or red ochre. One grave holds a young man with a twisted spine buried with the same care as anyone else. That hints at compassion, at a sense of community. This site also turned up footprints, frozen in ancient clay. The prints of a child and a wolf side by side. Did they walk together? Was it a pet? A wild animal? We'll never know, but it's a moment frozen in time. Some Ice Age sites show evidence of music and celebration. Bone flutes turn up in Germany, over 40,000 years old. These flutes are made from the wing bones of birds drilled with precise holes. When played, they make a clear, sweet tone. Imagine music echoing across the snowy plains. Maybe people sang, danced, or told stories by the fire. The instruments prove that even in the harshest times, humans found reasons to celebrate. What about clothing? We don't have any Ice Age shirts or pants left, but we have the tools for making them. Needles, scrapers, awls, all used for working hides. And in some places, tiny bone beads and shells suggest decorated clothes. Some archaeologists think people wore belts, necklaces, or even stitched patterns into their coats, not just for warmth, but for beauty, identity, or luck. And then there's the jewellery. At sites in France and Spain, people made necklaces out of animal teeth, ivory, and shells. Some beads are so small, it's hard to imagine how they drilled holes without snapping them. They must have taken hours to make. Why bother? Maybe to show skill, maybe to attract a mate, maybe for ritual reasons, or maybe just because humans like pretty things. Some groups used coloured ochre to decorate their bodies. The same red powder found in art was sometimes smeared on skin or hair. Maybe it meant something, like a badge or a mark of belonging, or maybe it was just for fun, just can't ask them, but the clues are there. One of the biggest mysteries is how people travelled such long distances. The Ice Age world was huge and the terrain was tough. Yet bands of humans moved across continents. In a lifetime you could travel from Spain to Siberia or from France to the edge of the Black Sea. They followed rivers, animal paths, and the edges of the ice. Some groups crossed land bridges that don't exist today. The most famous is Beringia, the strip of land that once connected Siberia to Alaska. This is how people first reached the Americas, walking across what's now the Bering Strait. The evidence is clear. Humans were in North America at least 15,000 years ago, maybe earlier. Stone tools, butchered animal bones, even footprints in ancient mud tell the story. These first Americans spread quickly, hunting mammoth, bison, and giant sloths. They left their own marks, different tools, different traditions, but the same drive to adapt and survive. Let's talk about the animals. The Ice Age was like a lost world full of giants, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, woolly rhinos, giant ground sloths, and more. These animals shaped human life. They were food, materials, threats, and sometimes symbols. Cave paintings show them in great detail. Bones and teeth ended up in jewelry and tools, but by the end of the Ice Age, most of these giants were gone. What happened? The answer isn't simple. Some scientists blame climate change. As the ice melted, grassland shrank and forests spread. Mammoths and other big grazers lost their food. Others think overhunting played a part. As human populations grew and hunting techniques improved, the pressure on animal herds increased. Some say it was a combination: climate, hunting, and even disease. But the result was the same. The giants vanished, and with them a way of life ended. But during the Ice Age, these animals were central. Some groups followed mammoth herds for generations. Others focused on reindeer, bison, or horses. In the far north, people hunted seals and fished. Each group had its own strategy, shaped by the land and the animals they depended on. Let's zoom in on a site in France called Pinsevent. It's about 12,000 years old, near the end of the Ice Age. Archaeologists found layers of charcoal, stone tools, and thousands of reindeer bones. But what's unique is how the remains are arranged. The bones are grouped by body part, with the best cuts near the hearths. People sat around the fire sharing the choicest meat while the scraps were tossed aside. You can see the pattern of daily life: hunters bringing in the kill, butchers breaking it down, cooks roasting the meat. Someone even lost a stone tool in the mud, dropped in the middle of dinner maybe. It's a snapshot of a moment, frozen in time. Other sites show signs of seasonal camps. In the summer, people spread out, fishing and gathering plants. In winter, they gathered in larger groups, sharing resources and stories. The rhythm of life matched the rhythm of the seasons and the movements of the herds. One thing that stands out: Ice Age people were flexible. When the climate shifted, they shifted too. When one animal disappeared, they found another. When the land changed, they learned new ways to survive. Some groups invented new tools or weapons. Others changed their diet or moved to new areas. That's what kept them alive. Let's look at the evidence for long-distance travel again. In Poland, at a site called Wilczys, archaeologists found flint tools made from rock that came from over 200 miles away. In Spain, beads made from shells that only live in the Mediterranean Sea turned up in mountain caves far from any beach. Someone carried those beads a long way, maybe as a trade item, maybe as a keepsake. It proves people travelled far, met other bands, and brought home new ideas. Some of the oldest human footprints in the world are from the Ice Age. In South America, at a site called Monteverde, footprints show a family, adults and children, moving across soft ground. In England, at Happisburgh, there are tracks left by kids, walking along a riverside over 800,000 years ago, from an earlier human species but still part of the story. It's a reminder that people have always wandered, always explored, always moved on when the world changed. And then there's the question of language. We can't dig up ancient words, but the complexity of Ice Age life suggests people talked. A lot. You can't organise a mammoth hunt, build a bone hut, or sew a fitted coat without good communication. Language was probably rich and flexible, able to describe animals, places, tools, and feelings, maybe even stories, jokes, songs. We can't hear their voices, but we can see the results. Ritual and belief were part of daily life. Graves with red ochre, beads, and carved figurines suggest respect for the dead. Some bodies are decorated or buried with care. Others are left in simple pits. There's even evidence of possible shamans, people buried with animal parts, strange objects, or in unusual ways. Maybe they were healers, storytellers, or leaders. Maybe they helped guide the group through hard times. Ice Age people left their mark in other ways too. Carved bones with notches, maybe counting sticks, maybe calendars. Stones with mysterious marks, symbols, maps, or just doodles. Even the arrangement of huts and hearths tells a story. People chose where to build, how to face the door, where to put the fire. Choices shaped by tradition, habit, or maybe just what felt right. The Ice Age world forced people to be resourceful. Every day was a challenge. But the evidence shows they didn't just scrape by. They learned, invented, shared, and even made time for art and music. They built homes, travelled far, and left behind clues that let us piece together their story. And when the ice finally began to melt, everything changed. The world warmed. The great glaciers shrank. New plants and animals appeared. Rivers flooded, seas rose, and old paths disappeared. Some groups moved north, chasing the edge of the retreating ice. Others stayed put, adapting to forests and grasslands. But that's another chapter. For now, what matters is this. During the Ice Age, humans did more than survive. They thrived. They invented new ways to live, to create, and to connect. They built a foundation for everything that came after. It's easy to forget how much was possible, even in the hardest times. The Ice Age wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a time of creativity, courage, and change. The evidence is scattered across the world, in bones, stones, beads, and footprints. Each piece tells a story of adaptation, hope, and the endless human drive to do more than just survive. And as the ice melted and the world shifted, humans were ready. They'd learned to face the unknown. That spirit, the willingness to adapt, to invent, to dream, carried them into a new age. When people talk about the revolution in early human history, they usually mean the shift to farming. But the word revolution makes it sound fast, like someone flipped a switch. In reality, it was slow. Thousands of years slow. It changed everything, though. The world after famine wasn't just a little different. It became unrecognizable compared to the world before. Let's start with the basics. For most of our time on Earth, people survived by hunting and gathering. That means they moved around looking for wild plants, animals, and fish to eat. They built temporary camps and followed the seasons. But then, something new started to happen. In a few places, people began to settle down. They started planting seeds. At first, it was just a few. Maybe they noticed that seeds dropped near their camps grew into edible plants the next year. Maybe someone tried scattering seeds on purpose. At some point, people realized they could control where and what they grew. The first signs of this shift show up in the Middle East, around 12,000 years ago. Archaeologists found pieces of wild wheat and barley at ancient sites in a region called the Fertile Crescent. This area stretches from modern Iraq and Syria through Turkey and down into Israel and Jordan. The land there was rich. Rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates flooded every year, leaving behind good soil. Wild grains grew thick in the fields. Herds of wild sheep and goats roamed the hills. Here's the thing. Even before true farming, people were already harvesting wild grains. They used stone tools to cut them, then ground the seeds into flour. They learned which plants grew best, when to gather them, and how to store the seeds for later. Over time, they started to help the process along. Maybe they cleared away weeds, or watered their favourite patches. They might have brought seeds from one place to another. Step by step, almost without planning it, humans were changing their environment. It took a long time for real farming to develop. Scientists think it happened in stages. First, pre-domestication cultivation. That's just a fancy way of saying people started to grow wild plants on purpose, but the plants were still basically wild. Over hundreds of years, the best seeds were saved and planted again. Plants that were easier to harvest, or produced bigger seeds, became more common. By the time true domestication happened, the plants had actually changed. Wheat, for example, lost the natural way it spread its seeds. Instead of shattering and dropping the seeds everywhere, the new wheat held on to them. That made harvesting easier for people, but the plant now depended on humans to plant it. Animals changed too. Around the same time people started farming, they began to tame animals. Sheep and goats were probably first. It makes sense. They're small, not too aggressive, and they eat grass. Wild sheep and goats were hunted for meat, but some were kept alive. Maybe at first they were trapped or penned for a while. Over generations, the calmest animals were allowed to breed. Little by little they changed. Wild animals became livestock. Sheep got woollier. Goats got less skittish. Soon people had herds they could manage. Cows and pigs came later. Dogs, though, were probably the very first animal humans tamed. That story goes back even further, maybe 15,000 years or more. But with farming, animal domestication really took off. People now had a steady supply of meat, milk, and hides. They didn't have to chase herds across the land. Food could be raised close to home. Why did this revolution happen? That's the big question. Why did some people give up the old ways and start this new path? No one answer fits every place. It wasn't just about hunger. In fact, early farming was hard. It took more work than hunting and gathering. Fields had to be cleared, planted, and weeded. Crops could fail. Pests and diseases were a risk. If the weather was bad, a whole year's food could be lost. So why do it? Some scientists think the end of the Ice Age played a big role. As the world warmed, forests replaced grasslands in many places. Big herds of animals got harder to find. Wild grains and plants, though, grew well in the new climate. People could gather more food in less space. That made it possible to stay in one area longer. Others suggest it was about population. As more people survived, groups grew larger. It became harder to move everyone around. Settling down meant more hands for planting and harvesting, but also more mouths to feed. Farming could support more people in one place. There's also the idea of feasting. Some archaeologists think early people wanted to show off, to hold big gatherings with lots of food. Farming gave them extra to share at these events. It became a symbol of status and power. Maybe it was a mix of all these reasons. The point is, people started to change the land on purpose. They cleared trees. They dug ditches to bring water to crops. They built storage pits for grain. Over time, the landscape itself began to look different. Let's look at a real example. There's a site called Jericho in modern-day Palestine. It's one of the oldest known settlements in the world, over 10,000 years old. Archaeologists found remains of mud brick houses, stone walls, and huge towers. People there grew barley and wheat, kept sheep and goats, and built walls for protection. The city grew up around a spring, which provided water even during dry years. Jericho wasn't a city like we think of today, but it was more than a simple camp. Hundreds of people lived there, year-round. They built houses close together, shared work, and defended themselves from outsiders. This was new. Before farming, people rarely stayed in one spot for long. Now, they built permanent homes. The first villages appeared. Farming spread slowly at first. From the Middle East, it moved into Europe, Africa, and Asia. Sometimes local people took up farming from their neighbours. Other times, farmers moved in and brought their crops and animals with them. By 8,000 years ago, people were growing rice in China and millet in northern China. In the Americas, corn, beans, and squash became the main crops. In Africa, yams and sorghum were important. Each region had its own plants and animals, shaped by local climate and tradition. This wasn't the end of hunting and gathering. For thousands of years, people mixed both ways of life. Some groups farmed in the summer and hunted or gathered in the winter. Others only farmed a little, just enough to get by. But the balance started to tip. Farming communities grew larger. They had more children. Over time, they took up more land. Let's talk about what changed because of this revolution. First, food was different. Farming meant more calories per acre. You could feed more people on less land. But the diet also became less varied. Hunter-gatherers ate hundreds of different plants and animals in a year. Early farmers ate mostly grains with some meat from livestock. This led to new problems. Skeletons from early farming sites show signs of malnutrition. People got shorter, and diseases spread more easily in crowded villages. Second, life got more predictable, but also less flexible. Farmers depended on the seasons. If the rains failed, crops withered. If a new pest appeared, whole fields could be lost. In a way, people traded freedom for security. They had more food most years, but the risk of disaster was higher. Third, farming changed the way people saw the world. Think about it. When you move all the time, you see land as something you pass through. When you farm, you start to see it as property. You want to protect your fields, your water, your animals. Fences, walls, and boundaries became important. Disputes over land started to matter. This led to new social rules. In small hunter-gatherer bands, everyone knew each other. Sharing was a way to survive. In larger farming villages, things got more complicated. Some families had bigger fields or more animals. Wealth started to matter. Leaders appeared. People who could organize work, settle fights, or defend the group. Sometimes they were chosen. Sometimes they took power by force or by family ties. Farming also changed daily life. In the old days, work was spread out. People gathered food for a few hours, then rested or did other things. Farming took up more time. Fields had to be hoed, watered, weeded, and guarded. Animals needed care every day. The work was hard, but it supported more people. Permanent homes meant new kinds of buildings. Mud brick houses, storage pits, and walls became common. People dug wells, built irrigation channels, and made pottery to store food and water. Pottery is a big clue for archaeologists. Before farming, people mostly used baskets or animal skins. Pottery was heavy but perfect for settled life. One of the biggest changes was in how people related to nature. Before farming, people took what the land offered. After, they tried to control it. They bred plants and animals for traits they liked. Wheat that stayed on the stalk. Sheep that gave more wool. Over time, the wildness faded from crops and animals. They became domesticated, dependent on humans to survive. This change wasn't just physical, it was mental. People started to plan for the future. They had to think about next year's harvest, about storing food for winter, about protecting crops from pests or thieves. Calendars became important. The earliest farmers probably watched the stars and the seasons, looking for the right time to plant or harvest. Let's take a closer look at a famous site, Çatalhöyük in Turkey. It's over 9,000 years old. Thousands of people lived there, in houses packed so close together that you walked on the roofs to get around. There were no streets. Each home had its own oven, storage bins and sleeping platforms. People painted their walls with images of bulls, leopards and people. They buried their dead under the floors. Life was crowded, but there was a strong sense of community. Archaeologists found evidence of farming, wheat, barley, peas and lentils. They also found bones from cattle, sheep and goats. But people still hunted wild animals and gathered wild fruits and nuts. It was a mix of old and new. Çatalhöyük is interesting because it shows how complex early farming life could be. People lived close together, shared resources and developed rituals and art. They made jewellery, pottery and tools. Some rooms were shrines decorated with animal horns and clay figures. It wasn't just about survival. It was about identity, belief and belonging. Farming led to bigger populations. Villages became towns. Towns grew into the first cities. This took thousands of years, but the seeds were planted in these early farming communities. But the revolution had a price. Farming made life possible in new ways, but it also brought new problems. Diseases from animals spread to people. Measles, smallpox and flu all started this way. Living close together meant infections moved faster. Food storage brought rats and mice. Sometimes crops failed for years, leading to famine. Social life changed too. In small bands, everyone worked together. In bigger villages, some people gained more power. They controlled land, food, or water. Inequality appeared. Some families had more, others less. Differences in wealth and status grew. This was the beginning of social classes. Land ownership became a big deal. People started to mark out fields, pass them down to their children, and fight over boundaries. Wars between villages happened. Defences like walls and ditches became common. The old way of sharing everything faded. Personal property took its place. Let's think about technology. Farming communities invented all sorts of new tools. Stone sickles for cutting grain, grinding stones for making flour, ploughs, first pulled by people, later by animals, pottery for storing, cooking, and carrying water, weaving for making clothes from plant fibres and wool. Each new invention made life a little easier, but also tied people more deeply to the land. Permanent homes led to new types of construction. People learned to make bricks from mud and straw. They stacked them to build houses that lasted for generations. Roofs were flat, sometimes made from reeds or wood. Walls were plastered and sometimes painted. This was a far cry from the animal hide tents of the past. One more big change. Time itself felt different. For hunter-gatherers, time followed the movement of animals and plants. For farmers, time was measured by the sowing and reaping of crops. The year became a cycle of work and waiting. People watched the weather, worried about floods or droughts, and hoped for a good harvest. Rituals and festivals grew up around planting and harvest times. Religion and farming became closely linked. The revolution spread slowly, but it never stopped. In Europe, farming moved west over thousands of years. In Asia, rice and millet spread along river valleys. In Africa, yams and grains moved south. In the Americas, corn, beans, and squash formed the base of new cultures. Each place adapted the idea to local needs and conditions. Why did some groups resist farming? Some environments made it hard. The Arctic, deserts, deep forests. These places didn't suit crops or livestock. Some people just preferred the old ways. Even today, a few groups still live by hunting, gathering, or herding. But farming won in most places, not because it was easier, but because it allowed more people to live together. It created surpluses, extra food that could be stored or traded. It made it possible to build villages, towns, and eventually cities. Trade networks grew. Farmers could swap grain for salt, pottery for shells, cloth for metal. Markets appeared. People began to specialize. Some farmed, others made tools, others traded. The simple division of labor became a web of jobs and skills. Knowledge spread too. New ideas moved along with seeds and animals. Someone in the Middle East learned to make cheese or beer. The trick spread to neighbors, then far beyond. Technology, art, and even language moved with people and goods. What did all this mean for the human story? Farming was the turning point. It set us on a new path, one that led to cities, writing, laws, and all the things we think of as civilization. It brought problems too: disease, inequality, war. But it also brought the chance for new kinds of life. People could build lasting homes, plan for the future, and dream bigger dreams. Looking back, it's easy to see the costs and the benefits. The farming revolution was messy, slow, and sometimes painful, but it made our world possible. And here's the thing. Farming didn't just change what people ate, it changed how they thought, how they worked, and how they lived together. It connected people to the land in new ways. It set off a chain reaction that led to everything that followed. So, the revolution wasn't just about food. It was about people shaping the world, and being shaped by it in return. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that's still being written today. And farming, as big as it was only the start. Because once people could feed more mouths and live close together, something even bigger was about to happen. Towns would grow, knowledge would spread, and the first true cities would rise from the earth. That's the next step in the story. When people think of the first cities, they usually picture something like ancient Rome or Athens. Huge buildings, fancy temples, busy streets. But real cities began long before those famous places. The very first cities were much smaller. They didn't have palaces or grand monuments at first. But they changed the world just as much as farming had. Let's start with what makes a place a city. It's not just about size. It's about people living close together in a permanent spot. There's some sort of government, even if it's simple. There are different jobs. Some people farm, others build, trade, or lead. There are rules, markets, and public places, and usually there's some kind of wall or boundary to keep outsiders out and the group together. The first true cities grew out of farming villages. At first it was just a few families, then a few hundred people, then, over centuries, thousands. These early cities appeared in different parts of the world, but the oldest and most famous are in a place called Mesopotamia. Today, that land is part of Iraq and Syria. Here's the thing. Mesopotamia means land between rivers. The two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. Every year they flooded and left behind rich, dark soil. Farming was easier here than almost anywhere else. People could grow more food than they needed. That meant some people could spend time doing something besides farming. Picture this. It's around 6000 BCE, more than 8,000 years ago. Along the river banks, clusters of mud brick houses line narrow paths. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Chickens cluck. Goats bleat from behind woven fences. A group of people is busy digging a new irrigation ditch, working together to bring water from the river to their fields. Children run between houses carrying baskets of bread or fruit. One of the oldest known cities is called Uruk. It started as a small village but grew into something much bigger. By 3500 BCE, Uruk was home to perhaps 40,000 people. That's as big as a modern small city. It covered almost 2 square miles. Thick walls surrounded it. Inside there were houses, workshops, storage buildings, and temples. The people of Uruk built temples out of mud bricks. The biggest was called the White Temple. It stood on a raised platform high above the rest of the city. It was painted white, shining in the sun. This wasn't just for looks. Temples showed the city's wealth and power. They were the centre of life in Uruk. People brought offerings, grain, animals, even jewellery to please the gods. But Uruk wasn't just about religion. There were markets where people traded goods, grain, cloth, tools, pottery. There were craftsmen who made jewellery, weapons, and statues. There were leaders who organised work, settled arguments, and kept order. Some people managed irrigation canals, making sure fields got enough water. Others watched the skies, tracking the stars and seasons. Uruk had another big claim to fame. It's the place where, as far as we know, writing was invented. People started by making simple marks on clay tablets. These marks stood for numbers, how much grain was stored, how many sheep belonged to a family who owed what to whom. Over time, these marks turned into symbols for words and ideas. Writing changed everything. But more on that later. Let's look at why cities formed in the first place. Farming villages could only get so big before they ran into problems. There's only so much land nearby. Too many people in one spot can mean fights over food or water. But in places like Mesopotamia, rivers and canals made it possible to feed more people. And when people had extra food, they could support leaders, builders, and workers who didn't farm. Having a lot of people close together made life more complicated. Villages had simple rules, but in cities you needed real laws. Who gets the best land? Who fixes the broken canal? How do you settle a fight between families? The earliest cities created councils or leaders to make decisions. Sometimes priests or kings took charge. In Uruk, the temple wasn't just for prayers, it was also a place where leaders met. Deals were made and records were kept. Let's zoom in on daily life in one of these first cities. Imagine walking through Uruk on a hot day. The streets are crowded and noisy. There's a market square where traders shout out their prices. Baskets of dates and onions are stacked high. Potters show off their latest jars and bowls. Somewhere, a group of men are hauling clay bricks for a new wall. Children chase each other, dodging donkeys carrying sacks of grain. Inside the houses, life is busy too. Women grind wheat on heavy stones, making flour for bread. Someone stirs a pot over the fire, mixing lentils and onions. In another room, a young boy learns to shape clay into little figures. Upstairs, someone weaves cloth on a wooden loom. At night, families gather on flat rooftops to eat, talk, and watch the stars. But life in a city wasn't always easy. When you put thousands of people together, problems grow. Waste and garbage piled up. Water had to be brought in, carefully managed, and kept clean. Diseases spread faster. Sometimes there wasn't enough food for everyone. If the crops failed, the whole city could suffer. That's why early cities needed systems. People dug canals, built storage buildings, and set up rules for sharing water. Some people became experts, builders, potters, metalworkers, or traders. Others became guards or soldiers, protecting the city from attack. Jobs became more specialized. Uruk wasn't the only early city. Let's look at another famous one, Eridu. This city is even older, maybe the oldest of all. It started as a small settlement by a freshwater spring, around 5400 BCE. Over time, Eridu grew into a religious centre. People built and rebuilt a temple on the same spot, layer after layer, for almost 2,000 years. Eridu may have only had a few thousand people at its peak, but it became a model for later cities. Another early city was Ur, not far from Uruk. Ur became famous later for its huge ziggurat, a kind of stepped pyramid made of mud bricks. The ziggurat was topped by a temple, shining with blue tiles. It was also known for its huge cemeteries. Archaeologists found tombs filled with gold, silver, and beautiful art. Some tombs even had chariots and the remains of servants, showing that some people were much richer than others. Here's something interesting. Early cities weren't just in Mesopotamia. Around the same time, cities started to appear in Egypt, India, China, and Central America. Each place was different, but the basic pattern was the same. People settled down, worked together, and built something bigger than themselves. Take Egypt, for example. The Nile River flooded every year, leaving good soil for farming. People built villages along its banks, then towns, and finally cities. Memphis and Thebes became famous centres of trade, religion, and government. In India, the Indus Valley people built cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. These cities had straight streets, brick houses, drains, and even public baths. They were carefully planned, showing real organisation. In China, the first cities appeared along the Yellow River. One of the earliest was called Early Tu. Archaeologists found palaces, workshops, and wide roads. There were bronze tools, jade carvings, and even musical instruments. In Central America, the Olmecs built cities with huge stone heads and pyramid mounds, surrounded by fields of corn and beans. What did all these first cities have in common? They were built near rivers or lakes, where water was easy to get and the land was fertile. They had some form of government, even if it was just a council of elders. There was trade, both inside and outside the city. Art and religion were important. And there was some kind of social order. Leaders, workers, farmers, craftsmen, and sometimes slaves. Let's talk about trade for a minute. Cities needed things that weren't found nearby. Uruk didn't have much wood or stone, so people traded grain and cloth for timber, copper, and precious stones from far away. Long-distance trade routes appeared. Some traders travelled hundreds of miles, crossing deserts and mountains to bring back goods. In return, they carried new ideas, stories, and technologies. Another thing cities brought was new technology. Pottery improved fast. Potters' wheels made it possible to shape bowls and jars quickly. Kilns baked pottery harder and more evenly. Metalworking became a big deal. People learned to melt copper, then mix it with tin to make bronze. Bronze tools and weapons were stronger and lasted longer than stone or bone. Building also changed. Mud brick houses got bigger and stronger. People learned to make arches and columns. Walls were built to protect against floods or enemies. Some cities had gates, watchtowers, and even moats. The city itself became a kind of machine, a system where every part had a job. Let's look closer at the social side. In small villages, everyone knew each other. In cities, that wasn't possible, so people invented new ways to connect. They formed groups, by job, by neighbourhood, by family. Priests and leaders became more powerful. Some families grew rich and passed their wealth down. Others worked as labourers, craftsmen, or servants. Inequality grew. Some people lived in large houses with courtyards. Others squeezed into small rooms. The gap between rich and poor became obvious. But the city also offered chances. A smart or lucky person could rise in status, become a merchant, a priest, maybe even a leader. Religion was everywhere in early cities. Temples were the biggest buildings. Festivals and rituals brought people together. Priests played an important role, keeping the gods happy, predicting floods, and helping with laws. Sometimes rulers claimed they were chosen by the gods. This gave them extra power. Evidence from the ruins tells us a lot. Archaeologists found clay tablets with lists, grain rations, debts, trades. They found jewellery, tools, toys, and even musical instruments. They uncovered huge storage pits filled with wheat and barley. In some tombs, they found gold cups and carved seals used to stamp ownership on goods. One of the most surprising things is how planned these cities were. In the Indus Valley, cities had straight streets set in a grid. There were drains running under the roads, an early sewer system. Public wells gave people clean water. In Mesopotamia, cities grew more chaotically, but still had main roads, courtyards, and special districts for workshops and markets. Let's not forget about defences. Early cities faced real threats: raiders, rival cities, wild animals, and floods. So, people built walls, ditches, and towers. Some cities even had armies, made up of citizens or hired soldiers. Weapons improved, from simple spears and bows to bronze swords and chariots. But not everything was about power and war. Cities became centres for art and culture. People carved statues, painted pottery, and built shrines. They played music on lyres and flutes. Some learned to write poems or keep records. Schools appeared, where young people learned to read, write, and do math. Let's talk about the downside for a moment. City life was crowded and could be dangerous. Fires spread quickly since most buildings were made of mud and reeds. Disease was always a risk. Garbage piled up in the streets. Water could get dirty. Sometimes people went hungry if crops failed or trade was cut off, and there was always tension. Cities had to balance the needs of many people. Arguments over water, land, or leadership could turn violent. Sometimes cities went to war with each other. Walls and armies became a way of life. But even with all these problems, the idea of the city kept spreading. People saw that cities could do things villages couldn't. They could build grand temples, store huge amounts of food, defend themselves, and invent new things. They became magnets for people looking for work, safety, or adventure. Let's return to Mesopotamia for a minute. Over time, dozens of cities appeared. They traded, fought, and sometimes joined together. The first kingdoms and empires were born. Rulers built bigger and bigger palaces. They collected taxes, kept armies, and wrote laws. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest law codes, was carved on a stone pillar in Babylon, a city that grew out of these early roots. It wasn't just about power. Cities also became places for stories and legends. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories in the world, was written in Uruk. It tells of a king's adventures, his search for meaning, and the struggles of city life. These stories helped people make sense of their world. Now, let's look at how cities changed the countryside. Farms and villages surrounded each city, feeding its people. In turn, cities provided markets, tools, and protection. Roads linked cities to each other, creating networks across the land. As cities grew, they pulled in more and more people from the countryside. But not everyone wanted to live in a city. Some people stayed in villages or on farms. Others moved away when life got too hard or crowded. Cities rose and fell. Floods, wars, or bad government could ruin a city. Sometimes whole cities disappeared, buried under sand or mud, and were forgotten for thousands of years. Archaeologists are still finding lost cities. Some are just mounds of earth, hiding bricks and pottery below. Others are buried deep, waiting for the right clues to be uncovered. Every new discovery adds to our picture of those first city dwellers. Let's not forget about the Americas. In what is now Peru, people built Corral, one of the oldest cities in the Americas, around 2600 BCE. Corral had plazas, pyramids, and neighborhoods. Its people grew cotton and traded with neighbors far away. In Mexico, later cultures built huge cities like Teotihuacan, with wide avenues and giant pyramids. In China, the Shang dynasty built walled cities with palaces and temples. Bronze bells and weapons have been found in their ruins. In Africa, people built cities along the Nile in Nubia and later in West Africa. Each place followed its own path, but the pattern was similar. All these cities had something in common. They changed how people lived, worked, and thought. They made it possible to build on ideas, to learn from each other, to organize and plan. They brought new problems, but also new chances. Let's stop for a moment and ask, why did cities matter so much? It's simple. Cities are where people pooled their knowledge, their effort, and their dreams. They became engines for change. In a city, you could learn from strangers, trade for things you'd never seen before, or invent something new. You could be part of something bigger than yourself. Cities also allowed for memory. With writing, laws, and stories kept in temples or palaces, ideas could last longer than any one person. People could look back at records, learn from mistakes, and plan for the future. But not everything was positive. Cities made people more dependent on each other. If the food supply broke down, everyone suffered. If a disease hit, it spread fast. If a leader made bad choices, the whole city could fall. Cities needed cooperation, rules, and sometimes tough decisions. As cities grew, they shaped the world around them. Forests were cleared for farmland. Rivers were dammed and channeled. Animals and plants were bred for city life. People changed the land, and the land changed them in return. And yet, the first cities didn't last forever. Some were destroyed by war or natural disasters. Others faded away as people moved on. But the idea of the city, the place where people come together, build, trade, and dream, never really disappeared. Today, when we look at the ruins of these first cities, we see the start of something huge. These were the places where history began to be recorded, where laws were made, where art and science took root. The story of the city is the story of people learning to live together on a bigger scale. And now, with cities came another leap forward, writing. The first written words, the first laws, the first stories. That's where the next chapter begins. So, cities changed everything. But there's one invention that might have changed us even more. Writing. The idea of putting words, numbers, or symbols onto something. Clay, stone, bone, or even papyrus, so that memories could last. That's one of the biggest leaps in all of human history. It's also one of the strangest when you stop to think about it. Let's start with a simple question. Why did people start writing? Most people today can read and write, or at least they know someone who can. But for almost all of human history, nobody could. If you wanted to remember something, you used your brain. If you wanted to share a story, you spoke it out loud. If you wanted to pass on knowledge, you taught it face to face. Everything depended on memory and word of mouth. Then, something shifted. People started making marks that stood for things. At first, it wasn't really writing the way we think of it. It was more like keeping score, counting goats, tracking grain, recording trades. Picture a clay tablet with a few lines and dots pressed into it. That's how it began around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Why did this happen right then? It's not just a lucky guess. Cities had grown. Life was more complicated. People needed to keep track of stuff. Food in storage, debts owed, trades made, taxes collected. Villages didn't need much record keeping. But a city with thousands of people and big stores of food? That's a different story. Imagine you're a grain keeper in Uruk. You collect bags of barley from every farmer. You have to hand out rations to workers, store extra grain for the winter, and make sure nobody is cheating. If you forget who brought what, or who's supposed to get how much, the whole system falls apart. So, you need a way to remember. Here's the thing, memory's amazing, but it's not perfect. People forget, people lie, people die, and their knowledge dies with them. But a clay tablet with marks, now that can last for years, it's not magic, but it feels close. At first these marks were simple, a line for one sheep, a circle for a bag of grain, that's it. But very quickly, things got more complex. People started using symbols for words, not just numbers. Soon they were writing down names, jobs, trades, and even prayers. Each mark stood for something. Together they could tell a story, or at least keep a record. This first kind of writing is called cuneiform. That just means wedge-shaped. The marks look like little wedges pressed into soft clay. If you had a sharp stick and some wet clay, you could try it yourself. It's really just a kind of code. But once you have a code, you can expand it. You can write down anything you can say. And then, something even stranger happened. People started to write things that weren't just lists. They wrote poems, laws, letters, myths. They wrote about kings, gods, floods, and battles. For the first time, stories could outlast the people who told them. Laws could be copied in every city. Prayers could be passed from temple to temple. Think about how huge that is. Before writing, if you wanted to know something, you had to find someone who remembered it. You had to trust their memory. Now, you could have a clay tablet or a stone carving that said exactly what happened, or what someone wanted you to believe happened. But writing didn't spread everywhere at once. In some places it showed up fast. In others, it took much longer. Let's look at a few different examples. In Egypt, writing appeared almost as soon as cities did. Egyptians used pictures called hieroglyphs. Some stood for whole words, others stood for sounds. They carved them on temple walls, wrote them on papyrus scrolls, or painted them on coffins. Egyptian writing is beautiful. Little birds, eyes, hands, and snakes. But it's not just art, it's a record. Lists of kings, prayers for the dead, stories of battles and floods. In China, early writing was different again. The oldest Chinese writing shows up on animal bones and turtle shells. People would heat the bones, read the cracks, and write down what they saw. They believed this was a way to talk to the spirits or the ancestors. Over time, their marks became regular. Each one stood for a word or an idea. That's the start of Chinese writing. It's changed a lot, but you can still see the link between those old marks and modern Chinese characters. In the Americas, writing took its own path. The Maya people of Central America invented their own system. It used pictures and symbols. Some stood for sounds, others for whole words. Maya writing was carved on stone, painted on pottery, or written in bark. Books. Some of those books survived, even after centuries of rain and war. All these systems had one thing in common. They let people store memory outside their heads. That's a huge deal. Once you can write things down, you can keep track of much more than before. You can plan for the future. You can look back at the past. You can share ideas with people far away or long after you're gone. But writing didn't just keep records. It changed how people thought. Here's why. When everything depends on memory, you have to remember things a certain way. Stories are passed down by repeating them, over and over. That's why old stories often rhyme or use patterns. It makes them easier to remember. But if you can write, you don't need to rely on memory tricks. You can be more precise. You can keep records that are much more complicated. Now you can say, that happened on the 20th day of the 3rd month 5 years ago. You can write, this land belongs to my family. Here's the proof. You can make a list of laws or debts or trades, and nobody can argue. You're remembering it wrong. Memory becomes public, not just personal. Writing also changes who has power. Before writing, knowledge belongs to the old, the storytellers, the priests. If you want to know the rules, you have to go ask them. But with writing, anyone who can read has access to that knowledge. The problem is, at first, almost nobody can read. Reading and writing are rare skills. In early cities, only a few people, scribes, learn to write. They become very important. Imagine being a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia. You wake up, wash your hands, and head to the temple school. You spend years learning how to make marks in wet clay. Day after day, you copy lists, animals, plants, goods. You learn the code. You practice again and again until you can write fast and neatly. When you're ready, you get a job for a leader, a trader, or a priest. You're one of the few people who can read the city's history. That's real power. Scribes kept the records that ran the city. Taxes, trades, laws, and stories. They wrote letters between cities. They copied myths and poems. They made sure the memory of the city outlived the people in it. But here's what's wild. Even though writing was one of the most important inventions ever, most people couldn't read or write. For thousands of years, writing was a special skill. Most people lived their lives without ever seeing a written word. Their stories, their memories, their lives, those were still passed down by voice and by heart. So writing didn't replace memory. It just added a new layer to it, a kind of external brain for the city. But that also meant a divide. The things that got written down survived, but the things that didn't, those could disappear forever. Let's look at how writing shapes what we know about the past. When archaeologists dig up a clay tablet, they can read about a trade, a law, a king's victory. But they almost never find stories about ordinary people. It's rare to find a letter from a farmer or a diary from a child. Most writing from ancient times is about leaders, gods, taxes, and rules. The rest is lost. Writing is a filter. It keeps some things, but lets others slip away. Think about your own life. What would happen if someone only judged your world by government records, bank statements, and a few official letters? All the little moments, jokes, games, secrets, dreams, would be missing. That's what happens with history. But even with all its limits, writing made it possible to store more memory than ever before. Cities could keep records for generations. Empires could copy laws and stories across huge distances. People could learn from mistakes made hundreds of years earlier. Here's another thing to think about. Writing isn't just marks on clay or paper. It's a way to organize thought. When you have to write something down, you have to be clear. You can't just ramble. You have to put things in order. You have to make sure someone else can understand, even if they weren't there. That's why writing helped create new kinds of thinking, history, science, philosophy. even math. You could write down ideas, test them, compare them, and argue about them across time and space. Take laws, for example. Before writing, rules were passed down by word of mouth. They might change a little every time someone told them. But when laws are written down, they become fixed. People can check them. They can say, that's not fair, it doesn't match what's written. This makes societies more organized, but also more rigid. Writing also means you can have history, not just stories about long ago, but detailed records. Who ruled? What happened? When? People could look back and try to learn from the past. They could compare rulers, wars, floods, and famines. But here's the strange part. The things that got written down weren't always the most important. Sometimes they were just what a leader wanted remembered. Sometimes only the names of kings and their victories made it onto the tablets or walls. The lives of regular people, the real struggles and joys, they were left out unless someone thought to write them down. That's why we have huge gaps in what we know about ancient cities. We know the names of kings, the amounts of grain collected, the rules of the temple. But we almost never see the world through the eyes of a baker, a child, a servant. Writing saves memory, but only the memory someone thought was worth saving. Let's talk about another side of writing, stories. The first stories ever written down weren't just records or laws, they were epic tales, myths and poems. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest we know. It's about a king, his friend, monsters, and the search for meaning. It's full of adventure, sadness, and big questions. Why? Do we die? What makes a good life? These are the same questions people still ask today. Writing made it possible for stories to last. They could be copied, changed, retold, and shared across hundreds of years. People who never met could share the same story, picture the same heroes, and ask the same questions. Writing also let people share ideas over huge distances. Letters could travel from one city to another. Merchants could send lists of goods. Rulers could send orders. Priests could send prayers. This helped link cities together, making trade, politics, and religion even bigger. But there's a cost to this new kind of memory. When stories are written, they become fixed. It's harder to change them, to adapt them to new times. Oral stories, the kind passed by word of mouth, are more flexible. They can change as the world changes. Written stories are more like snapshots. They freeze the ideas of one time, one place. So, writing is both a gift and a limit. It keeps memory alive, but it can also keep it stuck. It helps us remember, but sometimes it makes us forget what wasn't written. Let's step back for a moment and think about what this means for history. Almost everything we know about the world before writing is a guess. Archaeologists can dig up bones, tools, and ruins. They can piece together some clues. But without written records, so much is lost. We don't know the names of most people who ever lived. We don't know what they dreamed, feared, or loved. When writing appears, it's like someone finally turns on the lights. Suddenly we have names, dates, and stories. We can follow the rise and fall of cities. We can see how people changed their world and were changed by it. But even after writing began, most people left no trace. Only a tiny fraction of all the words ever spoken were written down. Only a tiny fraction of what was written has survived. Most clay tablets broke. Most papyrus scrolls rotted away. Most stories vanished. Still, writing changed the game. It made it possible for people to plan, build and organize on a scale never seen before. It made empires possible. It made science, math, and philosophy possible. It let people across the world share ideas, argue, and learn from each other. And at the heart of it, writing is about memory. Not the memory in one person's head, but the memory of a whole society. It's a way to fight against forgetting, to say, this happened, this mattered, remember. Of course, writing isn't perfect. Mistakes get made, stories get twisted, some memories are lost anyway, but it's still the best tool we've ever had for keeping the past alive. Today, we're surrounded by writing, books, screens, signs, notes, texts. Most of us can't imagine life without it, but for thousands of years people lived and died without ever seeing a word written down. They trusted memory, song, and story. So, the invention of writing isn't just a story about clever marks on clay, it's about the human struggle to remember, to share, to leave something behind. It's about the memories that last and the ones that slip away. And now, as we think about all the stories that were never written down, all the memories that vanished, a new question appears. What did we lose? What stories disappeared forever, lost before they could ever be remembered? So let's get honest for a second. It's easy to think history is just what we read in books, all those dates and names and battles. But really that's only a tiny slice of what's ever happened. Most of what people did, thought and felt, most of it's gone, lost, disappeared before anyone could write it down. Even after writing was invented, only a small number of people could use it. Even then, most things still slipped away. That's the big mystery of history. For every story we know, there are thousands we don't. It's kind of strange when you think about it. We have whole libraries full of books, but they don't even scratch the surface. Imagine a giant iceberg. The bit sticking out of the water is what we know. The rest, hidden below, is what we'll never know. Let's look at what that really means. Picture yourself standing in a huge desert. All around you there are pieces of old pottery, crumbled walls and broken tools. Maybe you find a clay tablet covered in marks. You can read a few lines. 10 jars of oil delivered, paid in grain. That's it. One tiny record from thousands of years ago. But what about the person who made the oil? Or the family who grew the grain? Did they laugh? Did they sing while they worked? Did they love someone? Did they tell stories at night? None of that is written down. It's all missing. We hear about kings and battles, but what about everyday life? How did children play? What jokes did people tell? What dreams did they have? Almost all of that is lost. It's not that people back then were boring or didn't care about these things. They just didn't write them down. Or if they did, those words didn't survive. Think of all the languages people once spoke. Today, there are about 7,000 languages in the world, but that number changes all the time. In the past, there must have been thousands more. Most of them are gone. No recordings, no books, no dictionaries, just vanished. The last speaker dies, and a whole world of words goes with them. Here's something wild. Even big events can disappear if nobody writes them down. We call this the lost history problem. Sometimes whole cities vanish from memory. Sometimes even empires do. Archaeologists dig up a ruined city and realize, wait, there was a whole civilization here. But there are no stories, no names, no records, just walls, bones, and broken pots. Take the city of Cahokia, for example. It was the biggest city in North America 1,000 years ago. It had huge mounds of earth, big enough to rival pyramids. Tens of thousands of people lived there. But nobody wrote down its name. Nobody wrote down its stories. By the time Europeans arrived, Cahokia was empty. The people had moved on or died. The city faded from memory. Only the mounds remained. We don't know what the people called themselves, what they believed, or even why they left. There are places like this all over the world. lost cities in the jungles of Central America, sunken villages under lakes in Africa, sand-covered ruins in the Middle East. Each one was once alive with people, noise, and stories. Now, most of those stories are gone. Sometimes things get lost even when people try to save them. Think about the Library of Alexandria. It was famous for its huge collection of scrolls. Some people say it held all the knowledge of the ancient world. Historians argue about how many scrolls there were. Maybe 40,000, maybe 400,000. But almost none of them survived. Fires, wars, and time destroyed those books. Now we only have a few scraps. We'll never know what was on most of those scrolls. Maybe some were just shopping lists. Maybe some held great poems or new ideas about the stars. It's not just big disasters that erase history. Sometimes it's just time. Most things rot, burn, or get washed away. Papyrus and parchment fall apart. Clay tablets break. Even carvings on stone can fade after thousands of years. The climate matters too. Dry deserts can keep things safe for a long time. Wet forests or rainy places destroy things fast. Let's talk about stories, actual stories people tell. Before writing, stories had to be repeated again and again to survive. If nobody told them, they vanished. Even after writing, most stories still depended on memory. Imagine a family sitting by the fire. The grandmother tells a story her mother told her. Maybe she changes a detail or two. Maybe she forgets a part. Over time, the story shifts and drifts. If the family breaks up, or if the next generation moves away, that story may disappear forever. Think about music and songs too. Most music in history was never written down. It was sung, played, or whistled. Each village, each family, each person might have had their favourite songs, but only a tiny, tiny number survive. The rest are gone. Even the earliest written music in the world is just a few notes or words scratched onto clay or stone. Imagine all the music people made as they worked, celebrated or mourned. Almost all of it is lost. And what about beliefs? We know a little about the gods people worshipped in ancient cities, thanks to carvings and statues. But what about the private beliefs? The secret prayers, the hopes whispered in the dark, the little rituals people did at home. Those things rarely got written down. They were too everyday or maybe too personal, so they vanished, leaving us guessing. The same goes for feelings and emotions. We can read about kings boasting of victories or priests saying prayers. But what did a mother feel when her child was born? What made people laugh until their sides hurt? What did they fear when storms rolled in? Sometimes we find a letter or poem that gives us a clue, but most of the time, those feelings disappeared without a trace. Here's a question. Why do some things survive, but others don't? Part of it is luck. A story written on stone might last for thousands of years. A story whispered at bedtime might last one night. But there's more to it than luck. People choose what to save. In most ancient societies, the things that got written down were the things leaders, priests, or wealthy people cared about. Taxes, laws, victories, prayers. Not jokes, not gossip, not the dreams of regular people. So, history has a kind of filter. It shows us what powerful people thought was important. The rest slips through the cracks. It's like listening to a radio with lots of static. You catch a few words but miss the full story. Sometimes we get a little lucky. A bundle of letters gets buried in a dry cave. A child's toy falls into a well and is forgotten. A wall painting survives, hidden under new layers of plaster. These things give us tiny windows into lost worlds, but they're rare. Now let's think about oral traditions. Stories told out loud, not written down. Some cultures have kept these going for thousands of years. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples tell stories that go back 10,000 years or more. These stories talk about how the land was formed, when the sea rose, or when big animals roamed the earth. Some of these stories match what scientists have found about the past, but many others have faded or changed. Oral stories can last a long time, but they're fragile. They depend on each new generation learning and repeating them. If a war, disease, or disaster kills off a group, their stories often die with them. Sometimes people are forced to change their language or move away. When that happens, old stories can get lost or broken. Let's look at lost languages for a moment. Around the world, there are ancient scripts nobody can read. The Indus Valley, for example, had its own script. People wrote it on seals and pottery about 4,000 years ago, but modern people can't read it. We don't know what most of the symbols mean. There's no Rosetta Stone to help us. The people who spoke and wrote those words are gone. Their language died out. Their secrets are locked away. Another example is Linear A, a script used on the island of Crete. Over 3,500 years ago, we have hundreds of tablets with these symbols. We know their words, maybe lists, prayers, or stories. But we can't read them. We can only guess. The people who knew the code are long gone. This isn't just a problem from a long time ago. It happens in more recent history too. In North America, for example, there were hundreds of native languages. Many had no written form. As people were forced to move or forbidden to speak their language, those words and stories disappeared. The last speaker of a language might have died just a few years ago. With them, a whole way of seeing the world is gone. Not all lost stories are from far-off times or places. Even our own families lose stories. Think about the things your grandparents might have known. Recipes, games, jokes, family secrets. If nobody writes them down or repeats them, they fade. One day you realize nobody remembers them anymore. So why does all this matter? Maybe you're thinking, if we don't know those stories, why worry? But lost stories mean lost knowledge. Sometimes it's practical knowledge. How to find water in the desert, how to heal with plants, how to build a house from mud and sticks. Other times, it's ideas, ways of thinking, ways of seeing the world, ways of solving problems. There are stories about farming, fishing, or making tools that could help us even now. There are old ways of living with the land, working together, or handling trouble that we could learn from. When those stories are gone, we lose not just facts, but wisdom. Lost stories also mean lost voices. If history is only told by the powerful, we miss out on the lives of regular people. We don't hear from the shepherd, the potter, the singer, the child, the dreamer. We only get part of the picture. Sometimes the stories that get lost are the ones that question the rules. Maybe someone once wrote a poem criticizing a king, but it wasn't copied or saved. Maybe someone had a new idea about the stars, but nobody wrote it down. The stories that survive are often the ones that fit the world as it was, not the world as it could be. So history is full of holes. We try to fill them in, but we can never know everything. Archaeologists dig, scientists test, and scholars guess. But most of the time, they're putting together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Sometimes, we find new pieces by accident. Someone uncovers an old diary in a wall. A farmer finds a buried statue while ploughing a field. A storm washes up a piece of pottery on the shore. Each new find is a glimpse into a missing world. But even with new discoveries, most stories are gone. That's just the way history works. It's normal to wish we could know more. What was it like to sit around a fire in a lost village? What did people whisper to each other at night? How did they see the world? We can only guess. Sometimes the best we can do is imagine. We look at what's left, the tools, the bones, the ruins. We try to picture the people who used them. We listen for echoes of their stories in the words and songs that survived. Every now and then, a lost story comes back to life. Maybe a language gets translated. Maybe a song is remembered. Maybe a story is pieced together from clues. But for every one that returns, thousands more are gone forever. Still, even lost stories matter. They remind us of how fragile memory is. They show us that every person who ever lived had a story, even if we'll never know it. The world is full of ghosts, not scary ones, but quiet echoes of people who once lived, loved, and dreamed. Maybe that's the real lesson. History isn't just what's written down, it's also what's missing. The gaps, the silences, the things we can't quite reach. We're always looking for answers, but sometimes the questions are just as important. So, next time you read a story from long ago, remember all the ones that didn't survive. Remember the people who left no trace, but who shaped the world in small, quiet ways. Their stories are gone, but their lives still mattered. And even though most things are lost, some pieces do make it through. Sometimes a single story, a scrap of writing, or a broken object can light up the dark. It's not everything, but it's enough to let us wonder. Enough to remind us that the past was full of people just as real as we are. But maybe not everything is lost. So, if most of history is lost, what actually remains? What has made it through all those years, all those fires, floods, wars, and quiet afternoons where nobody bothered to write anything down? What do we really have to work with? Let's start with the obvious stuff. The things you can touch. Physical objects. These are the survivors, the lucky few, really. Think about a stone tool from 2 million years ago. Someone shaped it, chipped away at it, held it in their hand. Maybe they used it to cut meat or scrape a hide. They probably never thought it would last for ages, but it did. It sat buried under dirt while thousands of years passed overhead. That's what's strange about history. Sometimes the oldest things are the ones that last the longest. Stone tools, bone needles, beads carved from shells, these things can survive for tens of thousands of years. The people who made them are gone, but the objects remain. They don't tell us everything, but they give us clues. Now picture a museum. Glass cases, quiet, halls, little cards with dates and places. Most of what you see there is hard stuff, stone, bone, metal, clay. Soft things almost never survive. If someone made a shirt from animal skin or a basket from reeds, it's probably long gone. Unless it got buried in a place with just the right mix of cold, dryness, or luck, it's vanished. But the hard things stick around. That's why we know so much more about tools and weapons than about clothes or baskets. But even with hard objects, there's a catch. For every item that survives, there are 1 million that crumbled away. Archaeologists dig for months and sometimes find just a handful of tools or pots. So, what we see is only a tiny sample. Sometimes an object survives just because it fell into a river and got covered in mud, or because someone dropped it in a cave. Sometimes it's pure chance. But let's talk about writing. That's the big game changer. When people started writing things down on clay, stone, wood, or papyrus, a whole new world opened up. Suddenly you didn't have to guess what someone was thinking. You could read their words written thousands of years ago. But here's the thing. Most writing didn't survive either. For every scroll that made it, thousands rotted away. For every stone carving still standing, others were smashed or worn down by wind and rain. Even so, writing gives us a lot more to work with. For example, the oldest known writing comes from Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Around 5,000 years ago, people there wrote on clay tablets using a wedge-shaped stick. The script is called cuneiform. Most of the time they wrote about business. Who owed what, who paid taxes, how much grain was in the warehouse. Not very exciting, maybe, but it's a window into their world. Some tablets tell stories. There's the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories we have. It talks about friendship, loss, and the search for meaning. It's not just a list of goods. It's a story about being human. The fact that it survived at all is kind of a miracle. Someone had to write it, someone else had to copy it, and then it had to survive thousands of years of chaos. But it made it. Now, not all writing is on clay. In Egypt, people wrote on papyrus, a kind of paper made from reeds. Some of these scrolls survived because the desert air is so dry. In China, writing started on bones and tortoise shells, and later moved to silk and paper. In the Americas, the Maya and other peoples wrote on bark, paper, and stone. Some of those records survived, some didn't. One thing you notice: the environment decides what makes it through. Dry places like Egypt or the deserts of the Middle East are great for keeping old things safe. Wet places like rainforests destroy things fast. That's why we know more about some places than others. It's not just about how smart or creative people were. It's about what the land could save. Let's shift gears. Think about buildings. Most buildings don't last. Wood rots, mud bricks melt in the rain, and even stone crumbles over time. But some structures are still standing. The pyramids in Egypt, Stonehenge in England, the temples of Angkor in Cambodia. These aren't just piles of rocks. They're evidence of people working together, dreaming big and making something meant to last. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, has stood for over 4,500 years. That's older than most writing. The stones are huge, some weigh as much as a truck. It took thousands of workers to build it. We don't have every detail about how it was done, but the pyramid itself is proof that it happened. Sometimes ruins survive even when the people are gone. In Central America you can walk through Maya cities, where trees grow through old temples. In Turkey there's a site called Göbekli Tepe that's over 11,000 years old. It has huge stone pillars covered with carvings. Nobody knows for sure what the site was used for, but the stones are still there, outlasting the people who built them by thousands of years. And then there's art. Sometimes ancient art survives in the most unlikely places. Deep in caves in France and Spain, you'll find paintings of animals, bison, horses, mammoths, drawn by people over 15,000 years ago. The caves are dark and hard to reach, but the images inside are vivid. Someone stood there with a torch, grinding up minerals for paint, and drew what they saw or imagined. Their names are gone, but their art remains. It's a message from the deep past. Cave paintings aren't the only art that survived. Carvings on stone, small figures made from clay or bone, beads and jewellery, all of these show that people cared about beauty and meaning. Sometimes the art is simple, a few lines scratched onto a rock. Sometimes it's detailed and full of life. Even without words, these pieces tell us something important. People wanted to leave a mark. Music is harder. Almost all ancient music is gone except for a few clues. But sometimes the instruments survive. Archaeologists have found bone flutes from over 40,000 years ago. Imagine someone sitting by a fire, playing a simple tune on a flute made from a bird's wing bone. The song is lost, but the instrument is real. It says, "We made music, we felt joy, we wanted to create." And what about stories? Most stories, as we said, were never written down, but some did survive, passed from person to person, across hundreds of generations. In Australia, some Aboriginal stories tell of events that happened 10,000 years ago, like the flooding of the coastline after the last ice age. These stories don't survive as objects, but as living memories, handed down by word of mouth. In some cases, scientists have checked the details and found they match real events from the distant past. Language itself can survive too, though it's rare. Some languages have changed very little in thousands of years. Icelandic, for example, is still close to the way Vikings spoke 1,000 years ago. Sanskrit in India has kept many of its old words and sounds. Hebrew was brought back to life after being forgotten as a spoken language for almost 2,000 years. Most languages change, split, or disappear, but a few stick around. Let's talk about DNA. This is a new kind of evidence. Scientists can now pull tiny bits of DNA from old bones, teeth, and even dirt. With this, they can figure out who lived where, who moved, and even what diseases people had. DNA isn't a story in words, but it's a record, one written inside living things. It tells us who our ancestors were, who they mixed with, and even what colour eyes they had. For example, by studying ancient DNA, scientists learned that people from Europe and Asia mixed with Neanderthals, a group of humans who disappeared about 40,000 years ago. Almost everyone outside Africa has a little Neanderthal DNA today. That's not something you'd know just from looking at bones or reading old stories. DNA lets us see connections that would otherwise be invisible. Another kind of survivor, traditions. Some customs have lasted for thousands of years. Think about the Olympics. The ancient Greeks started them almost 3,000 years ago. The game stopped for a long time, but the idea survived. People brought it back in the 1800s. Now the Olympics are a global event. The same goes for festivals, dances, and rituals. Some of these have changed, but the basic ideas are ancient. Food is another survivor, though it changes all the time. Some recipes and ways of cooking are really old. In China, people have been making noodles for over 4,000 years. In the Middle East, there are dishes that go back to ancient Babylon. In Mexico, people have been making tortillas from corn for thousands of years. The exact recipes change, but the main ingredients and methods connect us with the distant past. Let's not forget about numbers and math, the way we count, the symbols we use, and even some of our math tricks come from long ago. The Sumerians invented a way of counting by 60s, which is why we have 60 minutes in an hour. The ancient Egyptians figured out ways to measure land and build giant structures. The Greeks and Indians developed ideas about geometry and zero. Some of these ideas travelled across the world, changing as they went, but the roots are still there. Sometimes, what remains isn't a thing or a story, but a way of thinking. Philosophy, science, and religion have old roots. The questions people asked, why are we here? What happens when we die? What's right and wrong? Are the same questions people ask now. Some old answers survive in books, others in stories, others in the way we live. Even laws can survive. The Code of Hammurabi, written in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago, laid out rules for living together. Some ideas, like an eye for an eye, still echo in modern laws and stories. Roman law shapes the rules in many countries today. The details change, but the basic need for order and fairness sticks around. Now sometimes what survives is hidden. For years people thought the city of Troy was just a myth, something from old stories. But then, in the 1800s, explorers started digging in Turkey and found ruins that matched the stories. Turns out there really was a city in the right place, at the right time. Sometimes, myths and legends turn out to have a grain of truth. Another example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are old Jewish texts found in caves near the Dead Sea, starting in 1947. Some of the scrolls are over 2,000 years old. They were hidden away, maybe to keep them safe during war. For centuries nobody knew they were there. Now they help us understand what people believed and how they lived. Coins are survivors too. They last because they're made of metal. Ancient coins show us the faces of rulers, the names of cities, and sometimes important events. They're tiny records, carried in pockets, lost in the dirt and found centuries later. Maps are rare, but when they survive, they're gold. The oldest known map is over 4,000 years old. A simple clay tablet showing fields and rivers. Later maps show the world as people imagined it. Sometimes they're full of mistakes, but they tell us how people saw themselves in the world. And sometimes what survives is by accident. A volcano erupts, covering a city in ash, and suddenly everything is frozen in time. That's what happened in Pompeii, Italy, in the year 79. The lava and ash buried houses, streets, even food on tables. Centuries later, people digging in the ground found the city almost as it was on the day of the eruption. Walls, paintings, graffiti, even bread in ovens. It's all there. A disaster became a time capsule. Here's something else. Sometimes what survives is the shape of the land itself. Old roads worn into the ground, fields divided by stone walls, or even the outlines of ancient cities seen from the air. Farmers plough their fields and sometimes hit old foundations. Pilots fly over landscapes and spot circles or lines that don't fit. These are the fingerprints of lost worlds. There's also the stuff we can't see, but carry with us. Habits, sayings, tiny traditions. The way we shake hands, the words we use for family. Superstitions about luck or the weather. Some of these go back much farther than we realize. They're quiet survivors, hiding in plain sight. Of course, what survives can be misleading. Sometimes the things that last are the things that were built to last. Palaces, temples, tombs. Does that mean only kings and priests mattered? Not really. It just means that regular people's houses and tools didn't survive as well. So, we have to be careful. We see the past through a weird filter. Some things stand out, others get lost. But even with all these limits, what remains is still amazing. We can hold a stone tool made by someone who lived 50,000 years ago. We can read a poem from ancient Greece and feel a moment of connection. We can walk through old ruins and imagine the noise, the smells, the lives that fill those spaces. And every year, new things come to light. Someone digs a new site, cleans off an old painting, or finds a lost diary in an attic. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. The picture is never complete, but it gets clearer. So, what remains? Objects, buildings, art, writing, music, stories, languages, DNA, traditions, food, ideas, coins, maps, even habits. Each one is a thread, connecting us to people we'll never meet. Each one says, we were here, we made things, we dreamed, we loved. It's not everything, but it's enough to remind us how big and old the human story is. And even though most of history is lost, the things that do survive help us imagine the rest. They let us wonder, ask questions, and see ourselves as part of a long ongoing adventure. We may never know the Full story, but the pieces we do have are worth holding on to and looking at with fresh eyes. So, after all this, what does it really mean to have most of human history lost? What kind of picture do we get from these leftovers? And what do we do with all these gaps and mysteries? Let's start with the big idea. When you look at history, you're not looking at a clear, perfect photo. It's more like a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Some pieces are bright and detailed. A clay tablet here, a painted cave there. Other parts are just empty space. We'll never see the whole picture no matter how hard we try. But that doesn't mean it's pointless to look. If anything, the missing parts are part of what makes history so fascinating. Every object, every old story, every scrap that survives, it's a clue, it's a starting point. We use these to build our best guess about what happened. Think about how detectives work. They rarely get the whole story handed to them. Instead, they find a footprint, a fingerprint, maybe a piece of fabric. From these, they imagine what happened. Historians do the same thing, just with much older clues. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. But the process itself is what matters. Even with all these gaps, there's still a pattern. When you look at what survives, you see that people everywhere, in every age, wanted the same basic things: food, shelter, safety. But once those needs were met, they reached for more. They wanted meaning. They made art, built monuments, told stories, made music. They reached for something bigger than themselves. And here's what's really interesting. Even though most of the details are lost, the big themes stick around. We don't know the names of the first people to draw on cave walls. We don't know who first sang a song or who first told a story around a fire, but we know those things happened. We know that reaching for beauty and connection is part of being human. That's why the things that do survive matter so much. Every old bead, every broken pot, every faded painting is a voice from the past. It's someone saying, "I was here, I mattered." Even if we don't know their name, we hear their echo. The gaps in history can be frustrating, but they're also a gift. They leave room for wonder. They let us imagine, dream, and ask questions. What was it like to live in a world before cities? How did people manage with only stone tools? What did they worry about? What made them laugh? What did they believe about the stars? Some people get nervous when they hear how much is missing. They want solid answers, clear facts. But life isn't like that, and neither is history. Uncertainty is part of the deal. In a way, it's comforting. It means there's always more to find, more to ask, more to explore. And here's something else to think about. The parts that do survive are sometimes the things that mattered most to people at the time. But other times, it's just luck. A clay pot lasts longer than a leather shoe. A stone carving survives where a wooden tool rots away. So, what we know about the past is shaped by chance, by what the earth decided to keep. That's why it's important to be humble when we talk about history. We don't know everything. We probably never will. But that's okay. The mysteries are what make it interesting. Every time someone digs up a new artifact or cracks a new code or finds a forgotten story, it changes what we thought we knew. The story keeps growing. Now, let's flip things around. If so much is lost, does that make the present any different? Think about your own life. Most of what happens to you will never be written down, never be remembered by anyone else. The little things, what you ate for breakfast, a joke you told, a walk you took, are here, then gone. But some things might last. Maybe a photo, a letter, a song you liked. Maybe a story you told that someone remembers. The same goes for whole societies. Most of what people do disappears almost right away. But a few things stick. Those things shape how future people see us. They'll never get the full story, but maybe they'll get enough to understand what kind of people we were, what we cared about, and what we dreamed. There's something comforting about that. It means you don't have to be famous or important to leave a mark. The things you do, kindness, creativity, curiosity, might survive in ways you can't even imagine. Maybe not as an object or a building, but as a ripple, passed from one person to another. Let's zoom out even more. The story of human history isn't just about old bones or broken pots. It's about change. People started with nothing but their hands, their brains, and what they could find around them. They learned, they invented, they adapted. Over time they built villages, then cities, then whole civilizations. They faced disasters, wars, and plagues. Sometimes everything they built fell apart, but people kept going. That's the real thread that runs through history: resilience. The ability to keep going even when things are hard, to build again after a flood, to start over after a war, to hope even when the world seems dark. That's what our ancestors did, again and again. The things that survive, tools, art, ruins, stories, are proof of that resilience. They're evidence that people before us faced tough times and made it through. They struggled, but they also laughed, loved, and created. They weren't so different from us. The missing pieces remind us that nothing lasts forever. Even the strongest stone wears away. Even the greatest city can be lost. But the spirit that built those things, that urge to create, to remember, to reach for something more, keeps going. It jumps from one generation to the next. If you look at ancient ruins, you can almost sense it. The people who built them are gone, but the stones are still there. The same goes for old stories and songs. The names have faded, but the feelings are still fresh. Joy, fear, wonder. These are as old as humanity itself. Here's another way to think about it. History's like a long, winding river. Sometimes it runs deep and clear, and you can see all the way to the bottom. Other times it's muddy and full of twists and turns. Sometimes it disappears underground, only to pop up again somewhere else. The river never stops, even when you can't see all of it. We're all part of that river now. We're shaped by what came before, even if we don't know all the details. The languages we speak, the food we eat, the ways we celebrate, all of these come from somewhere far back in time. Most of the steps are invisible, but the journey continues. When you look at the stars, you're seeing the same sky people saw thousands of years ago. When you tell a story, you're doing something as old as humanity itself. There's a comfort in that, a sense of connection that stretches across time. So what should we do with all these gaps and mysteries? Should we try to fill them? Should we accept that some things will always be unknown? Maybe the answer is both. We can search, dig, and wonder. We can also accept that some mysteries are part of what makes life interesting. They leave space for imagination. It's easy to wish for perfect answers, to want a clear record of everything that ever happened, but maybe it's better this way. The unknowns give us room to dream, to tell stories, and to find our own meaning in the past. Sometimes not knowing is the best part. It's what draws us in, keeps us asking questions, keeps us curious. The search itself is part of being human. When you walk through a museum, or read an old story, or see a photo of an ancient ruin, remember this. Most of what happened is gone, but what's left is enough to remind us how far we've come and how much we share with the people who came before us. And every day, new clues show up. Someone finds an old grave, a lost city, a story written in a forgotten script. Each new discovery changes the way we see ourselves. It's a never-ending adventure. Now, let's think about the future. Someday, we'll be the ancient ones. The things we make, the stories we tell, the dreams we chase. They'll be the clues for people who come after us. They'll wonder about us the way we wonder about those who came before. Most of our lives will vanish, just like theirs did. But some things will survive. Maybe not the things we expect. Maybe not the things we think are important. But something will make it through. A song, a photo, a word, a habit. Those small things will carry our story forward. So the next time you see an old artifact, a faded photo, or a crumbling ruin, pause for a moment. Think about the people behind it. Think about what they hoped, what they loved, what they feared. You're part of the same story, even if the details are different. That's the real lesson of history. We're all connected by invisible threads stretching back through time. Most of the story is lost, but the parts that remain are enough to remind us who we are, enough to give us wonder, enough to let us dream. In the end, history isn't just about the past, it's about us, all of us, together, on the long road from the beginning to now. Most of the journey is hidden, but the traces we find are enough to light the way. So, as you drift off tonight, remember, you're part of a story that started long before you and will keep going long after. That story is full of darkness and light, loss and survival, memory and forgetting. But every piece that survives is a message, passed down through time. We may never know the full story, but the search, the wonder, and the spark of curiosity, that's what makes us human. And that's what keeps the story alive